In the depths of the Virunga Mountains, a routine safari becomes a battle for survival and redemption. A grieving wildlife photographer, Amara Thorne, arrives in Africa carrying the weight of her lost child, unaware that fate is about to confront her with an impossible choice. When a storm strikes, a mountain gorilla steps out of the mist carrying her dying infant. In an act never witnessed before, the mother gorilla places her newborn into Amara's arms, entrusting a stranger with the most fragile piece of her world. That moment ignites a chain reaction of danger, betrayal, and revelation. As Amara fights through flooded jungles to keep the baby alive, she discovers that poachers, corrupt insiders, and a hidden trafficking network have woven themselves into her expedition. Trust fractures, loyalties shatter, lives hang in balance. At the story's peak, a desperate escape across a collapsing rope bridge forces Amara to gamble her own life for the infants, a moment that draws the gorilla troop into a breathtaking rescue that rewrites everything science believed about their intelligence and empathy. The aftermath uncovers something even more staggering. Amara's own daughter, missing for 2 years, has been alive all along, raised by a hidden forest community overlapping the gorilla's territory. Her destiny, intertwined with the wild in ways no one imagined. What begins as a fight to save a gorilla infant becomes a story of 2 mothers, 2 children, and the extraordinary power of trust that bridges the gap between species, grief, and time. This is The Gorilla's Gift, a story of love, survival, and the wild's quiet way of choosing the people it can trust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you're subscribed because we have many more deeply inspiring stories to share with you.
The storm arrived without warning, turning the African jungle into a theater of chaos. Rain hammered against the roof of the stranded safari vehicle as lightning split the sky, illuminating faces pressed against fogged windows. Inside, 7 people sat in terrified silence, watching something impossible unfold before their eyes. Through the downpour, a massive figure emerged from the mist, a mountain gorilla, moving with purpose toward the vehicle. But this was no territorial display, no act of aggression. The gorilla carried something precious against her chest, cradling it with a tenderness that defied every scientific understanding of wild animal behavior. Amara Thorne, wildlife photographer and broken soul, found herself stepping out of the vehicle despite the screams of her companions. Her camera hung forgotten around her neck as she extended her trembling hands. The gorilla, later identified as Kora, a 14-year-old female, approached without hesitation. In her arms lay a newborn, barely 2 weeks old, its breathing shallow and irregular. What happened next would be captured on 4 different cameras and would spark international debate among primatologists, behaviorists, and philosophers for years to come. Kora gently, almost reverently, placed her dying infant into Amara's arms. The gorilla's massive hand touched Amara's rain-soaked face, a gesture so unmistakably human it seemed to bridge the evolutionary gap between species. Then Kora turned and vanished into the storm, leaving behind her most precious possession in the hands of a stranger. The baby's heartbeat fluttered against Amara's palm, weak and erratic. She had felt this exact sensation before, in another life, holding another child who had been lost forever. As thunder rolled across the mountains and her companions erupted in panicked arguments, Amara made a silent vow to the darkness: this baby would not die. Not while breath remained in her body. She didn't yet know that this moment, this impossible gift from a desperate mother, would set off a chain of events involving international criminals, life-threatening danger, and a revelation that would shatter everything she believed about her own devastating loss. 7 days of routine safari photography had just become a fight for survival that would test the limits of human compassion and animal intelligence. The wild had chosen Amara Thorne for a purpose she couldn't yet comprehend. And there would be no turning back. 7 days earlier, Amara Thorne had stepped off a charter plane at Wilson Airport in Nairobi, carrying more than just camera equipment. She carried the weight of 2 years of grief, guilt, and unanswered questions that had transformed her from one of National Geographic's most celebrated wildlife photographers into a hollow shell of her former self. The assignment had been an ultimatum from her editor, Patricia: return to work or lose her position permanently. Amara had chosen Africa not because she wanted to heal, but because she wanted to disappear into landscapes so vast that her pain might finally seem small by comparison. Her story was one that had made headlines 2 years prior, though she wished it hadn't. But during a family hiking trip in Colorado's Rocky Mountains, her 3-year-old daughter Lily had vanished. The search effort had been massive: helicopters, tracking dogs, hundreds of volunteers combing the wilderness for weeks. The official conclusion had been devastating. The child had wandered off the trail during a moment when Amara had been distracted by her camera, fallen into a ravine, and been swept away by spring floods. No body was ever recovered. Amara blamed herself completely. 30 seconds of distraction, that's all it had taken to destroy her world. She had spent the following 2 years searching obsessively, refusing to accept the official findings, alienating her husband until their marriage crumbled, and slowly withdrawing from life itself. The silver locket she wore immediately contained Lily's photograph, a reminder of her failure that she couldn't bring herself to remove. The Virunga Mountains on the Rwanda-Uganda-Congo border became her escape. This region housed fewer than 1,000 mountain gorillas, one of Earth's most endangered species. The 2-week photography expedition promised isolation, purpose, and the kind of demanding work that might quiet the endless loop of guilt playing in her mind. But Amara wasn't alone. The expedition team consisted of 7 people, each carrying their own hidden agendas and secrets that would soon collide with catastrophic consequences. Jabari Mwangi served as their guide, a 48-year-old Kenyan with 25 years of experience navigating guerrilla territory. His knowledge of the jungle was encyclopedic, his instincts honed by decades of reading animal behavior and weather patterns. He carried a rifle he claimed never to have fired, and his eyes constantly scanned the tree line with a wariness that suggested he'd seen things tourists never did. Dr. Elena Reyes, a Spanish primatologist, had spent 6 years studying mountain gorilla social structures. Brilliant and intense, she documented everything obsessively in leather-bound notebooks. What the others didn't know was that she harbored a professional rivalry with Amara dating back years to a disputed photograph credit. Elena's academic career had been built on guerrilla research, and she viewed journalists like Amara as exploiters who profited from animals without truly understanding them. Marcus and Claire Dalton presented themselves as a wealthy American couple celebrating their 30th anniversary with a luxury safari experience. Marcus, 53, spent more time on his satellite phone than observing wildlife, despite claiming to be disconnected from his business ventures. Claire, 51, photographed everything compulsively but with the detached air of someone documenting possessions rather than experiences. Their expensive gear and designer safari outfits marked them as typical wealthy tourists seeking bragging rights. But the final member was David Okonkwo, a 26-year-old Kenyan ranger assigned to the expedition for safety protocols and regulatory compliance. Idealistic and eager to prove himself, David had grown up in a village so impoverished that becoming a ranger represented the pinnacle of achievement for his family. He spoke passionately about conservation, but couldn't quite hide the desperation in his eyes, the look of someone who understood that passion didn't pay for medicine, food, or education. The first 3 days unfolded according to plan. The group photographed elephants at sunset, lions lounging in grassland shade, and the sweeping vistas that made Africa legendary among wildlife enthusiasts. Amara went through the motions mechanically, her technical skills intact but her emotional connection to the work severed. She framed perfect shots and felt nothing. Everything changed on day 4 when they entered the dense mountain forest where gorillas were known to roam. Jabari immediately noticed irregularities in the gorilla troop's movement patterns. But the tracks indicated erratic behavior, doubling back, avoiding traditional feeding areas, moving with an urgency that suggested flight rather than normal foraging. But something was wrong. That afternoon they spotted the troop for the first time. 15 individuals led by an enormous silverback the rangers had named Bakari, 450 pounds of muscle and protective instinct. Among the females was Kora, identifiable by a distinctive silver patch on her left shoulder. She clutched a newborn to her chest with unusual intensity, never setting it down even when other mothers allowed their infants to explore.
Dr. Elena observed through binoculars and made notes in her journal. The infant appeared premature, underweight, possibly suffering from congenital defects. Kora's behavior indicated she knew something was medically wrong with her baby. The constant holding, the refusal to let other troop members near, the anxious vocalizations all pointed to a mother recognizing her infant might not survive. But there was something else happening in this jungle, something far more sinister than natural selection. On day 5, while tracking the gorillas through morning mist, Jabari discovered wire snare traps hidden in the undergrowth. He cut one down with his machete, his jaw clenched in barely controlled fury. Snare traps were brutal instruments that caught animals indiscriminately, causing them to either bleed out slowly or chew off their own limbs in desperate escape attempts. More evidence appeared as they followed the trail of abandoned poacher camps with fresh ashes in fire pits, ammunition casings, dried blood splattered on vegetation. Most disturbing was the discovery of a gorilla hand hacked off and discarded, likely taken as a trophy or ashtray for the black market. Jabari explained the grim reality. The Konda brothers, notorious poachers with international connections, had been systematically working through this region for months. Their operation was sophisticated and ruthless. Kill the protective males, capture the infants alive, and sell them to private collectors for staggering sums. An infant mountain gorilla could fetch $200,000 from exotic animal enthusiasts willing to pay premium prices for the illegal and the rare. The group debated their options. Marcus insisted they report to authorities and evacuate immediately. Elena argued for staying to document evidence and protect the troop through their presence. David, as the ranger, officially recommended evacuation but seemed oddly hesitant to enforce it. Jabari made clear the danger if the Konda brothers knew humans were interfering with their hunting ground. They wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. Amara said nothing during these debates. She simply continued photographing the gorillas, particularly Kora, sensing something she couldn't articulate, a connection forming across species lines that defied rational explanation. That night, unable to sleep, Amara sat outside her tent beneath a canopy of stars. Movement in the darkness made her freeze. 20 feet away, barely visible in the moonlight, stood Kora. The gorilla had left her troop and approached the human camp behavior that contradicted everything known about mountain gorilla caution around humans. For several minutes, woman and gorilla simply looked at each other. Kora's infant stirred against her chest, whimpering weakly. Amara felt tears sliding down her face without knowing why. In Kora's eyes, she saw something she recognized, the terror of a mother watching her child slip away, powerless to stop it. Kora eventually retreated into the jungle, but Jabari found evidence the next morning that the gorilla had circled their camp multiple times during the night. She had been studying them, evaluating them, making calculations no wild animal should be capable of making. The team pressed deeper into gorilla territory on day 6, following the troop's trail. Tension built with each hour. Marcus grew increasingly agitated, checking his satellite phone obsessively despite the lack of signal. David seemed distracted, missing obvious trail signs that even the tourists noticed. Elena documented everything in her notebooks with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Amara sensed the convergence of invisible forces, the dying infant, the hunting poachers, the team's hidden tensions, and her own unresolved grief creating a volatile mixture awaiting ignition. She photographed Kora whenever possible, capturing images of maternal devotion so raw they hurt to witness. On the 7th morning, massive storm clouds gathered over the mountains. Jabari insisted they evacuate immediately. The dirt roads would become impassable rivers within hours, trapping them without communication or supplies. They packed hastily and began the 40-mile journey to the ranger station. They never completed that journey. The convergence that had been building for days was about to explode with consequences none of them could have predicted. And at the center of it all would be Amara Thorne, about to receive a gift she never asked for and didn't know how to accept. The wild was preparing to teach her that some bonds transcend species, language, and even death itself. The storm hit with apocalyptic fury. Within minutes, visibility dropped to mere feet as rain hammered the jungle with tropical intensity. Jabari navigated the safari vehicle carefully along the muddy track, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. The passengers sat in tense silence, each lost in private thoughts as lightning illuminated the canopy in strobing flashes. Then Jabari slammed on the brakes. Blocking the road ahead stood the entire gorilla troop. 15 massive primates formed a living barricade, rain streaming off their dark fur. Bakari, the silverback, stood at the front, chest beating and roaring a territorial display that made the vehicle's frame seem suddenly fragile. The tourists screamed. Marcus shouted for Jabari to reverse. But the guide's hands remained frozen on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on something the others hadn't yet noticed. Kora was separating from the troop, moving toward the vehicle with deliberate purpose. And the way she carried her infant had changed. The baby hung limply against her chest, its tiny arms no longer gripping her fur, its eyes half closed and unfocused. Even from a distance, the signs were unmistakable. The infant was dying. "Doctor." Elena gasped in recognition. Hypothermia from the cold rain, dehydration, possibly cardiac failure from congenital defects. The Ba had hours at most, perhaps only minutes. In the wild, there was no intervention, no veterinary care, no hope. Nature's cruelty was playing out exactly as it had millions of times before. But Kora wasn't accepting nature's verdict. The gorilla approached the vehicle directly, ignoring the screaming humans and the drumming rain. Her eyes, dark, intelligent, desperate, locked onto Amara through the rain-streaked window. And in that moment, Amara understood. She didn't know how she understood, couldn't explain it scientifically or rationally, but she knew with absolute certainty Kora was asking for help. Before Jabari could stop her, before her own fear could intervene, Amara opened the vehicle door and stepped into the storm. Rain soaked through her clothes instantly, thunder crashed overhead. Behind her, Marcus was shouting something about stupidity and death wishes. Elena was calling out scientific protocols. David had grabbed the emergency radio, babbling about protocols and procedures. But Amara heard none of it. She walked 3 steps forward and stopped, arms extended, palms up. A universal gesture of offering, of trust, of willingness to help. Kora approached until they stood barely 2 feet apart. This close, the gorilla's size was overwhelming, 200 pounds of pure muscle that could tear a human apart in seconds. Her breath came in heavy pants, visible in the cold rain. Her eyes never left Amara's face. Then Kora did something unprecedented in recorded primate behavior. She gently, almost reverently, placed her dying infant into Amara's outstretched hands. The baby was shockingly light, barely 5 pounds. Its fur was soaked and cold. Its chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Amara felt the tiny heartbeat against her palms irregular, weakening, fading. And she felt something else, the terrible weight of responsibility, of trust, of a mother's desperate gamble on a stranger's compassion. Kora's massive hand reached up and touched Amara's face. The gentleness was heartbreaking, a caress that spoke of hope and fear and the kind of love that transcends language. For 3 seconds that felt like eternity. Woman and gorilla stood face to face in the pouring rain, connected by something primal and profound. Then Kora turned and vanished into the jungle, leaving her most precious possession behind. Amara stood frozen in shock, cradling the dying infant against her chest. The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and dim, before closing again. Its tiny hand gripped her finger with the last of its strength. She had felt this exact sensation before, Lily's small hand gripping her finger in those first precious days of life, before everything fell apart. The others erupted from the vehicle. Elena immediately began examining the infant, her scientific detachment cracking as she realized the severity of its condition. Hypothermic, severely dehydrated, heartbeat dangerously irregular, possibly less than an hour from complete organ failure. Without veterinary intervention, incubators, IV fluids, Cardiac monitoring the baby wouldn't survive the trip to the ranger station. Jabari attempted to radio for emergency evacuation, but the storm had knocked out the relay tower. They had no communication with the outside world. The nearest medical facility capable of treating an infant gorilla was the ranger station 40 miles north, and the roads were already flooding. Marcus Dalton made his position clear. They needed to leave the infant, save themselves, and report the incident to proper authorities. Interfering with natural selection, he argued, was both dangerous and ethically wrong. The mother had rejected the baby because it wasn't viable. They should respect that decision and focus on their own survival. Claire disagreed quietly but firmly. She had seen Amara's face during the transfer. Whatever had passed between woman and gorilla hadn't been rejection. It had been true. Saint. David frantically explained ranger protocols. Any interaction with endangered species required immediate reporting. Any possession of gorilla infants triggered international trafficking laws. Any deviation from established procedures could mean criminal charges. But his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes kept darting toward Marcus in a way that suggested consultation rather than command. Dr. Elena laid out the scientific reality. Kora hadn't rejected her baby, she'd protected it. A weak infant made the entire troop vulnerable to predators and poachers. By giving the baby to humans, Kora had removed an immediate threat to her group, while simultaneously testing whether these particular humans were intelligent enough to save her offspring. It was a calculated risk, a desperate gamble, and possibly the most sophisticated problem-solving behavior ever documented in wild gorillas. But they faced an impossible situation. The baby was dying. They had no medical supplies. The roads were flooding. Communication was down. And somewhere in the darkness, Kora and her troop were watching, waiting to see what the humans would do. Amara made the decision that would define everything that followed. Her voice was quiet but absolute. They were keeping the baby alive. They were finding Kora, and they were proving they deserved the trust that had been placed in them. Because if they didn't, if they let this infant die through inaction or cowardice, she would never forgive herself. Not after Lily, never again. Jabari tried to drive forward, hoping to reach higher ground before the roads became completely impassable. The vehicle moved 50 feet before sinking axle-deep in mud that had the consistency of wet cement. The engine roared uselessly as tires spun without purchase. They were stranded, night was falling, the temperature was dropping. And cradled against Amara's chest, wrapped in her rain-soaked jacket, a dying gorilla infant struggled for each labored breath. The team made Emmy. Regency camped beside the stranded vehicle, rigging tarps for shelter and rationing their limited supplies. Amara sat in the vehicle's cargo area, focused entirely on the baby. Elena provided what guidance she could keep it warm, attempt hydration with clean water from their supplies, monitor breathing and heart rate, pray for miracles. Through that endless first night, Amara talked to the baby. She told it about Lily, about loss and love, and the unbearable weight of watching a child slip away. She confessed her guilt, her failure, her desperate need for redemption that she knew a dying animal couldn't provide but needed to express anyway. She told the baby about Kora's trust, about the impossible decision a mother had made to save her offspring. She promised over and over that this baby wouldn't die alone or unloved. That even if medical intervention failed, it would know in its final moments that it had been fought for, valued, cherished. Outside, David maintained watch, reporting strange sounds, branches breaking systematically, the deep vocalizations of silverback gorillas, movements that circled their camp without approaching. Jabari confirmed what David heard. The troop was out there, maintaining distance but staying close. Bakari was enforcing some kind of quarantine, keeping other males away while Kora waited to see if the humans could deliver on the implicit promise she'd extracted. And in the darkness beyond human vision, other eyes watched as well. The Kanda brothers had been tracking this troop for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity. They'd witnessed Kora's baby being born premature, had noted its weakness, and had planned their capture attempt for when the infant would be too young to survive separation. A desperate mother would make mistakes, create opportunities, but now the infant was in human hands. The poachers' entire operation faced disruption. And the Kanda brothers hadn't built their empire by accepting setbacks peacefully. They were moving into position, making calculations, preparing contingencies. Multiple forces were converging in the darkness. Maternal love, human guilt, criminal greed, scientific curiosity, and desperate need all spiraling toward collision. And at the center of the maelstrom, Amara Thorne held a dying infant and made silent vows she had no idea how to keep. By dawn, against all odds, the baby was still alive, barely clinging to life, but alive. And that fragile survival meant the real journey was only beginning. The first rays of sunlight revealed the magnitude of their predicament. The safari vehicle sat mired in mud up to its axles. Rain-swollen streams had cut across the road in multiple places, and the jungle pressed in with claustrophobic intensity. Jabari's assessment was grim. The vehicle couldn't be extracted without heavy equipment, and attempting to hike 40 miles to the ranger station while carrying emergency supplies and a critically ill infant would take at least 3 days through treacherous terrain. But the baby had survived the night, which gave them something precious: time. Not much, maybe 48 hours before the infant's weakened system simply shut down, but enough to make an attempt. Elena had managed to get small amounts of water mixed with crushed fruit into the baby during the night, and its heartbeat, while still dangerously irregular, had stabilized slightly. The infant remained hypothermic and deeply lethargic, but it was fighting. Amara had barely slept, monitoring the baby's breathing throughout the night, adjusting the makeshift nest of jackets and thermal blankets every time the infant showed distress. Her own body temperature had kept the baby warm, skin-to-skin contact providing what medical equipment couldn't. She had sung lullabies, the same ones she'd sung to Lily, her voice breaking on half-remembered lyrics. The team packed what they could carry: water purification tablets, emergency rations, first aid supplies, rain gear, and Elena's research documentation. They would have to travel light and fast, following the guerrilla troops' trail in hopes of reuniting mother and infant before the baby's condition deteriorated beyond recovery. Jabari took point, reading the jungle with the fluency of someone who'd spent his entire life in this environment. Broken branches showed where the guerrillas had passed. Knuckle prints in soft earth indicated direction and timing. Specific bird calls, which he identified, instantly revealed the troops' location ahead of them. He also noticed things that worried him: human boot prints that weren't from their group, the lingering smell of cigarette smoke in an area that should be pristine, and signs of recent trail cutting with machetes. The poachers were close. Very close. As they trekked deeper into the jungle, Elena explained what she believed was happening from the guerrillas' perspective. Kora hadn't abandoned her baby, she'd outsourced a problem she couldn't solve. By giving the infant to humans, she'd accomplished multiple objectives: removed a vulnerability from her troop, tested whether these specific humans could be trusted, and bought time to see if the baby would survive with intervention. If the humans succeeded in keeping the infant alive, Kora would reclaim it. If they failed, she'd avoided watching it die slowly in her arms. It was, Elena emphasized, an extraordinary demonstration of abstract reasoning, future planning, and understanding of human capabilities. Kora had essentially conducted a risk assessment and made a calculated gamble that defied everything primatologists thought they knew about wild gorilla cognition. But they weren't just following the gorillas, they were being followed as well. David spotted signs first: disturbed vegetation that didn't match gorilla movement patterns, the fresh remnants of a human camp less than a mile from their route, and most disturbing, a vantage point on a hillside that offered perfect view of their group's movements. Someone was tracking them systematically. On the second day of the trek, they discovered evidence that transformed concern into horror. In a small clearing, they found the body of a juvenile male gorilla, maybe 7 years old. His hands had been hacked off, his skull had been crushed by a bullet. The body had been there less than 12 hours, based on decomposition and insect activity. This wasn't an old kill, it was fresh, deliberate, and positioned where the troop would eventually find it. A message from the Kanda brothers: "This is our territory, these are our targets, and anyone who interferes will be dealt with accordingly." Claire vomited at the sight. Marcus's face went pale, his earlier bravado about respecting nature evaporating when confronted with the reality of human cruelty. David's hands shook as he photographed the scene for evidence. Elena documented everything in her notebook, her scientific detachment finally cracking as she whispered prayers in Spanish. Amara simply held the baby tighter and kept walking. She'd seen too much death in the past 2 years to be shocked by more. But she felt something cold and hard crystallizing inside her, determination that bordered on obsession. This baby would not become another casualty, not while she had strength to prevent it. Jabari found the poachers' trail leading away from the kill site. Two men, heavily loaded, moving north toward known black market transit routes. He made a decision. They would alter their path, angling west to avoid potential confrontation while still following the guerrilla troops' general direction. Safety had to take precedence over speed. But changing routes meant crossing more difficult terrain, ravines, dense undergrowth, river crossings where the storm-swollen water ran fast and dangerous. The group's progress slowed. Hours passed in exhausting physical labor, hauling each other up muddy slopes, wading through thigh-deep streams, cutting through vegetation with machetes. Throughout the journey, Amara maintained constant contact with the baby. She fed it every 2 hours using improvised methods Elena devised. She kept it warm against her body. She talked to it constantly, narrating their journey, describing the jungle, sharing memories of Lily. The infant's condition remained precarious but stable, a state Elena described as suspended between living and dying, waiting for something to tip the balance. On the second night, they made camp in a small cave that offered shelter from another round of storms. The baby's breathing had grown more labored, its tiny chest working hard for each breath. Elena checked its vitals and delivered crushing news. The infant had perhaps 24 hours remaining before complete cardiac failure. Their window was closing. David took watch at the cave entrance, and that's when he noticed something that had been developing over the past 2 days. The guerrilla troop hadn't scattered or moved away. They'd been paralleling the human group's journey, maintaining distance but staying close. Kora was tracking them, watching, evaluating. Jabari confirmed the observation. He'd noticed signs of the troop's presence throughout the trek, fresh feeding sites, nesting areas, the distinctive sounds of guerrilla communication. Bakari was keeping the troop within monitoring distance while preventing direct contact. It was shepherding behavior, protective surveillance, another demonstration of sophisticated planning, but there was a problem developing that none of them had anticipated. Marcus and David had been having whispered conversations throughout the journey, stopping abruptly whenever others approached. Marcus had been dropping back from the group repeatedly to check his satellite phone, despite knowing they were far beyond any signal range. David had started making navigation suggestions that didn't allig with ranger training or common sense. Claire noticed her husband's strange behavior and started asking questions he deflected with increasing irritation. Elena observed David's nervousness and began reviewing her documentation, cross-referencing dates and events with a growing sense of unease. Amara noticed none of this. Her entire world had narrowed to the fragile life in her arms and the impossible promise she'd made. She didn't see the hidden glances, the whispered conversations, the subtle positioning of people who were preparing for something the others hadn't yet recognized. On the morning of the third day, David announced he'd made contact with Ranger reinforcements using an emergency beacon. He'd arranged a rendezvous point in a clearing 2 miles ahead. Relief flooded through the exhausted group. Finally, medical help for the baby. Finally, extraction from this increasingly dangerous situation. Finally, safety. They reached the clearing by midday, pushing through their exhaustion for one final effort, and that's when everything they'd believed about their journey collapsed. That's when the betrayal was revealed, and the true purpose of this expedition became horrifyingly clear. 3 men waited in the clearing. They wore no ranger uniforms. They carried military-grade weapons. And Marcus Dalton greeted them like old friends while David Okonkwo stood beside him, no longer even pretending to be the idealistic ranger he'd claimed to be. The trap had been set days ago, and Amara, carrying the dying infant and consumed by her mission of redemption, had walked directly into it. The truth assembled itself in fragments that coalesced into nightmare. Marcus Dalton wasn't a tourist. He was a dealer in exotic animals with connections spanning 3 continents. The safari expedition hadn't been an anniversary vacation but an acquisition operation designed to secure an infant mountain gorilla for private sale. David Okonkwo hadn't been a ranger assigned for safety protocols, but an inside man recruited with promises of money his impoverished village desperately needed. Marcus laid it out with casual brutality. The plan had been elegantly simple. Wait for a berth in Kora's troop. Use controlled burns or tranquilizer darts to separate the infant during a moment of chaos and transport it through established smuggling networks to Kenya where buyers waited. An infant mountain gorilla would fetch $200,000 from the right collector, wealthy individuals who wanted the ultimate exotic pet, private zoos operating without oversight, or research facilities willing to pay premium prices for animals they couldn't acquire legally. But Kora's premature birth and her unprecedented decision to give the baby to Amara had complicated everything. Marcus had initially been frustrated by the development, but David had convinced him it was actually better. Let the humans keep the infant alive with their resources and emotions, then take it when it was stabilized and more valuable. The three men in the clearing weren't rescue rangers. They were Marcus's partners in the trafficking network. They'd been tracking the group since day one, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. And now, with the baby stabilized enough to survive transport, with the group exhausted and isolated, with no communication to the outside world, that moment had arrived. David's voice cracked as he tried to justify his betrayal. His village had no running water, no electricity, no medical clinic. Children died from preventable diseases. Education was non-existent. When Marcus had offered $20,000 to help acquire a baby gorilla, it had seemed like a miracle money that could transform an entire community. How could he refuse? How could he choose animals over his own people? Marcus showed no such moral conflict. He explained dispassionately that the infant would go to a private sanctuary in Southeast Asia where it would receive excellent care, live in comfort, and serve as a breeding specimen for future generations. It was, he insisted, better than dying in the jungle, better than natural selection's cruelty. They were actually saving it. Amara stood frozen, the baby clutched against her chest, understanding with sick clarity that everything she'd fought for had been orchestrated by people who saw compassion as exploitable weakness. Then Dr. Elena Reyes stepped forward and detonated her own revelation. She wasn't merely a primatologist conducting behavioral research. For 2 years, she'd been working undercover for Interpol's Wildlife Crime Unit, investigating trafficking networks across East Africa. Marcus Dalton had been a target of her investigation for 18 months. She'd joined this expedition specifically to gather evidence and coordinate his arrest. Elena pulled official identification from her vest, explaining that she'd been documenting everything, recording conversations, photographing evidence, building a prosecutorial case. She'd already transmitted preliminary findings to her Interpol contacts using a concealed satellite communication device. She'd thought she could control the situation, make arrests at the ranger station, wrap everything cleanly. But David's involvement had been unknown to her intelligence, and Kora's actions had accelerated the timeline beyond her ability to manage. Now she stood in a jungle clearing with 3 armed traffickers, a corrupt ranger, an exhausted photographer, and a dying gorilla infant, trying to execute an arrest she had no physical power to enforce. Marcus laughed. David Lowe oaked ill. The 3 armed men simply watched, hands near weapons, waiting for orders. The clearing erupted in shouted arguments. Marcus demanded Amara hand over the infant. Elena ordered everyone to surrender and wait for actual authorities. David begged Marcus to just let them go, to forget the whole thing, sobbing that he never wanted anyone hurt. Claire screamed at her husband, asking who he'd become and how she'd never seen it. Jabari's rifle came up, aimed at Marcus, his finger near the trigger. For 10 seconds, the jungle held its breath. Violence hung in the air like humidity, waiting for the first person to move, to speak, to make the choice that would determine whether anyone left this clearing alive. Then David, panicking and desperate, pulled his service weapon and fired a warning shot into the air. The gunshot cracked across the jungle like thunder. Birds erupted from trees, insects fell silent. And somewhere close, very close, a silverback gorilla roared. The entire troop exploded from the undergrowth. 15 gorillas crashed into the clearing from multiple directions, moving with coordinated purpose that suggested planning rather than panic. Bakari charged directly toward Marcus and his armed men, 450 pounds of pure protective fury. 3 adult females created a barrier separating Amara from the traffickers. Juvenile gorillas scattered the humans' equipment and supplies with casual swipes of massive arms. But they didn't attack. The gorillas didn't tear anyone apart, didn't kill, didn't even seriously injure. They simply created chaos, disrupted human plans, and established dominance over the space. Through the pandemonium walked Kora. She moved calmly, purposefully, directly toward Amara. Her eyes held no aggression, no fear, only focus. She brought her family not to retrieve her baby through force, but to protect the human who'd been protecting it. Amara understood in that crystalline moment what Kora had orchestrated. The gorilla had been watching the entire time, reading the dynamics, recognizing who the threats were and who the allies were. She'd waited for the perfect moment when the threats had revealed themselves, when chaos created opportunity to make her move. Between Amara and Kora lay a ravine, 40 feet deep with a storm-swollen river crashing over rocks below. The only crossing was a rope bridge that Jabari had warned them never to use, a relic from decades-old logging operations, fraying and unstable, swaying dangerously even in calm conditions. Kora stood on the far side, arms outstretched. The message was unmistakable. "Bring me my baby. Cross the bridge. Trust me as I trusted you." Marcus shouted for his men to shoot, to take the infant by force, to kill the gorillas if necessary. One of the traffickers raised a rifle toward Kora. David screamed at him to stop. Elena threw herself at Marcus, grappling with him. Jabari's shot rang out, deliberately missing but close enough to make the traffickers duck for cover. In the chaos, Amara made her decision. She ran for the bridge. The world contracted to a single point of focus. The swaying rope bridge, the dying infant pressed against her chest, and Kora waiting on the opposite side. Behind her, voices screamed warnings, commands, threats. Amara heard none of it. Every fiber of her being concentrated on crossing 40 feet of rotting rope and ancient wood planks while protecting the fragile life in her arms. Her first steps onto the bridge sent it swaying wildly. The ropes creaked under her weight. Wooden slats that had seemed solid from a distance proved treacherous up close. Some cracked at the slightest pressure. Others had rotted through entirely, leaving gaps that revealed the churning river below. The storm from days earlier had swollen the water into a violent torrent filled with debris, fallen trees, and rocks that would pulverize anything caught in the current. Behind her, Marcus broke free from Elena's grip and lunged toward the bridge. Jabari intercepted him with a tackle that sent both men crashing into the mud. The traffickers moved to support Marcus, but found themselves facing the silverback Bakari, who had positioned himself between the armed humans and the bridge. The gorilla didn't charge. He simply stood there, a living wall, communicating through pure presence that anyone attempting to cross would have to go through him first. David stood frozen in moral paralysis, his weapon hanging uselessly at his side, watching his desperate gamble for village prosperity collapse into violence and chaos. Claire had retreated to the tree line, her camera documenting everything with shaking hands, recording evidence that would eventually convict her own husband. Amara reached the bridge's midpoint. The infant stirred against her chest, its breathing labored and rapid. She could feel its tiny heart racing, could sense its system shutting down. They'd run out of time. If she didn't get this baby to Kora immediately, all of this, the journey, the trust, the promise, would mean nothing. "That's W." And she heard the snap. David's warning shot had done more damage than he'd intended. The bullet had struck one of the bridge's main support ropes, fraying it nearly through. The added weight of Amara and the baby, combined with the swaying motion, completed what the bullet had started. The rope parted with a sound like a whip crack. The bridge lurched violently to one side. Amara's feet slipped on the wet planks. She grabbed for the remaining rope railing with one hand while clutching the baby with the other. For a horrible moment she hung suspended, feet dangling over the void, the river roaring 40 feet below. The baby slipped in her grip, its weak hands unable to hold on, its body sliding toward the gap between her arm and chest. On the far side of the ravine, Kora began vocalizing a sound primatologists would later describe as extreme distress calling. The gorilla reached toward Amara, arms extended, her cries echoing across the chasm. She was watching her baby fall to its death and was powerless to prevent it. Amara's fingers were slipping. The rough rope was tearing skin from her palm. The baby was sliding free. She made a choice born of pure instinct. She released the rope to wrap both arms around the infant, sacrificing her own safety to secure the baby's. She fell. For a fraction of a second, gravity claimed her. The river rushed up to meet them. The baby's eyes opened, looking directly into hers, and Amara saw Lily's face superimposed on the gorilla infant, 2 children she'd failed, 2 lives slipping through her inadequate grasp. Then a massive hand caught her wrist. Bakari had done something unprecedented in recorded gorilla behavior. The silverback had assessed the situation, recognized the danger, and found an alternative route. A fallen tree trunk lay across the ravine 30 feet upstream, thick enough to support his weight. He'd crossed it, moved along the ravine's edge with shocking speed, and positioned himself to intercept Amara's fall. The foo, our 150-pound silverback, pulled her up with one arm, demonstrating both impossible strength and shocking gentleness. He set her on solid ground, examined the baby briefly with surprising delicacy, then turned back toward his troop to continue defending them from the armed humans. Amara collapsed on the muddy ground, gasping, her shoulder screaming from the wrenching force of the catch. The baby lay against her chest, still alive, still breathing, still fighting. She'd made it across. Barely, but she'd made it. Kora approached immediately, dropping to all fours beside Amara. The gorilla's massive face came within inches of the humans, and for several heartbeats they simply breathed the same air. Then Kora gently lifted her baby from Amara's arms. The transfer was achingly tender. Kora examined her infant thoroughly, checking for injuries, listening to its breathing, feeling its heartbeat. The baby stirred weakly, recognizing its mother, trying to grip her fur with fading strength. Kora vocalized softly, making the reassuring sounds mothers of every species use to comfort their young. On the opposite side of the ravine, the situation deteriorated catastrophically. Marcus Dalton, enraged at seeing his $200,000 prize vanish across an impassable chasm, grabbed a rifle from one of his men. His face contorted with fury and greed, he aimed not at the gorillas but at Amara herself. His logic was vicious and simple. If he couldn't have the baby, he'd punish the woman who'd cost him a fortune. He'd make an example that would discourage other interfering idealists. He'd salvage something from this disaster, even if it was only revenge. Elena saw the movement and launched herself at Marcus a second time. She wasn't trained in combat, wasn't prepared for violence, but she threw herself forward anyway, driven by moral imperative rather than tactical skill. Her body collided with Marcus's as he fired. The bullet went wild, angling upward but not far enough. The round struck Amara in the left shoulder, just below the collarbone. The impact spun her around and dropped her to the ground. Blood spread across her shirt in a rapidly expanding circle. The pain was white-hot, all-consuming, obliterating thought and vision. Through fading consciousness, Amara saw Kora clutch her baby tighter and begin backing toward the jungle. The gorilla paused, turned back one final time, and touched Amara's face with the same gentle gesture she'd used during the storm. Then she was gone, vanishing into the dense undergrowth with her infant, protected by her troop. On the other side of the ravine, David finally broke his paralysis. Seeing Amara shot, seeing the consequences of his greed made manifest in blood and suffering, he threw himself at Marcus with abandon. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs and rage. Jabari and one of the traffickers grappled for control of a weapon. Claire screamed for everyone to stop, her voice breaking with horror at what her husband had become. The fight was brief and desperate. Elena, despite having no combat training, fought with the fury of someone defending principles more important than personal safety. Jabari's decades of survival experience gave him advantages Marcus's men lacked. And David, consumed by guilt and self-loathing, fought with suicidal intensity, no longer trying to win, just trying to prevent more damage from his catastrophic choices. The resolution came from an unexpected source. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the jungle noise, growing rapidly louder. Elena's satellite transmission had reached Interpol hours earlier. Kenyan Wildlife Service rangers, guided by her GPS coordinates, had been inbound since dawn. They'd been delayed by the storm damage and difficult terrain, arriving minutes too late to prevent the violence, but just in time to prevent murder. The helicopter couldn't land in the dense jungle, but its presence ended the fight immediately. Loudspeakers in 3-seer languages ordered everyone to stand down. Ropes dropped from the hovering aircraft. Rangers in tactical gear fast roped down, weapons ready, moving with the precision of people trained for exactly this scenario. Marcus and his men surrendered when they realized escape was impossible. David collapsed to his knees, hands behind his head, weeping openly. Claire continued filming, documenting her husband's arrest with the detachment of someone already planning divorce proceedings. Amara lay on the muddy ground, blood pooling beneath her, consciousness flickering like a dying candle. Medics rushed to her position, assessing the gunshot wound, establishing an IV line, preparing her for evacuation. Through the haze of shock and pain medication, she kept asking the same question. Did the baby survive? Did Kora take her baby? Did it work? The medics had no answer. They focused on stabilizing her for the helicopter extraction, on preventing her from bleeding out in the jungle, on medical protocols that had nothing to do with gorillas or trust or impossible promises between species. As they loaded Amara onto a stretcher and hoisted her toward the hovering helicopter, her last conscious image was of the jungle canopy, endless green stretching in every direction, hiding countless lives and stories and miracles that humans would never witness or understand. She'd done what she could. She'd kept her promise. The rest was beyond her control, in the hands of nature and fate and a mother gorilla who'd recognized something in a grieving human that transcended the vast gulf between their worlds. Amara woke 3 days later in a private room at Nairobi Medical Center. The bullet had been removed, the damage repaired, and her shoulder immobilized in a complex brace that would require months of physical therapy, but she'd survived. Against considerable odds, she'd survived. Her first visitor was Dr. Elena Reyes, who arrived with a tablet full of documentation and eyes red from insufficient sleep. The primatologist explained what had transpired in the 72 hours since the confrontation. Marcus Dalton and his 3 associates were in custody, facing charges in Kenya, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The evidence Elena had collected, combined with testimony from multiple witnesses, had exposed a trafficking network spanning 5 years and 6 countries. Interpol estimated the operation had been responsible for acquiring and selling over 30 endangered animals worth more than $8 million on the black market. David Okonkwo faced a more complex fate. His cooperation with investigators providing detailed information about the network's logistics, contacts, and methods had earned him immunity from trafficking charges. But he'd lost his position as a ranger, lost the respect of his community, and would spend years trying to reconcile the gap between his intentions and his actions. The money Marcus had promised never materialized. David's village remained as poor as ever, only now carrying the additional burden of shame. Claire Dalton had filed for divorce before leaving Kenya. Her footage from the expedition would become crucial evidence in multiple prosecutions and would eventually be featured in a documentary about wildlife trafficking that won international acclaim. She'd testified against her husband without hesitation, her 30-year marriage dissolving the moment she'd seen him aim a rifle at an unarmed woman holding a baby. Jabari had returned to his work as a safari guide, now with an international reputation as the man who'd say stood between tourists and armed criminals. His rifle, still never fired at a human being, remained a comforting presence he hoped never to need. But Amara's first question was the same one she'd asked while bleeding in the mud. Did the baby survive? Elena smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed her usually serious face. The Rangers had been tracking Kora's troop continuously since the confrontation. The baby was alive, not just alive, thriving. Within hours of being reunited with its mother, the infant had begun nursing properly. Its body temperature had normalized, its heartbeat had stabilized. Whatever medical crisis had been developing had somehow resolved once the baby was back in its natural environment with its mother's care. The Rangers monitoring the troop reported seeing the infant nursing, moving, responding to stimuli with increasing strength. Kora had accepted the baby back completely, showing no signs of rejection or abandonment. The troop had closed ranks around mother and infant, providing protection and support. Against tremendous odds, against medical expectations, the baby had survived. Elena delivered one more piece of information. The ranger team had officially named the infant Amara after the woman who'd risked everything to protect her. The name would enter the scientific record, would be used in research papers and conservation reports, would become part of the documented story of this unprecedented cross-species interaction. Then Patricia, Amara's editor, arrived with a laptop and news that would shatter everything Amara thought she understood about her own past. The Rangers analyzing expedition footage for legal proceedings had noticed something in one of Amara's photographs, the one taken just before she'd crossed the bridge. The image was slightly blurred from camera shake, but in the background, barely visible through the trees, was a small human figure. A child with blonde hair. The discovery had prompted immediate investigating. Rangers searching the area found a child's shoe size 7, pink with white flowers, weathered but identifiable. The exact shoes Lily had been wearing when she vanished 2 years earlier in Colorado. Colorado authorities contacted with this information had reopened Lily's case. What they discovered had been missed during the original investigation. Approximately 30 miles from where Lily disappeared existed a small, reclusive community of conservation workers who'd chosen to live permanently within the protected forest. The community followed an old tradition when lost children wandered into their territory. They were taken in, cared for, and raised as part of the group. No communication with outside authorities. No records, no questions asked. They'd had Lily for 2 years, calling her Naya, which meant purpose in their language. She spoke Swahili now, played with village children, called an elderly woman Mama, and had no clear memory of her life before the forest. The search helicopters had been looking in the wrong area, focused on the ravine where officials assumed she'd fallen, never extending their grid far enough to discover the hidden village. Kora's territory overlapped with this community's land. The gorilla had seen Lily, seen the blonde child playing in the forest, adopted and thriving among humans who weren't her birth family. When Kora's own baby faced death, she'd sought out Amara specifically, recognizing the grief-stricken woman from photographs Amara had shown the troop days earlier while trying to build trust. The cognitive sophistication required was staggering. Kora had connected a lost blonde child with a grieving photographer. She'd understood that this particular human would comprehend the stakes of protecting an infant. She'd gambled that someone who knew the pain of losing a child would fight with everything she had to return a baby to its mother. She'd been right. The revelation hit Amara with the force of a physical blow. Lily was alive, had been alive this entire time, 30 miles from where she'd disappeared, living a life Amara had never imagined. All her guilt, her searching, her obsessive inability to accept the official findings, all of it had been rooted in a truth she'd sensed but couldn't prove. Mothers know. Somehow, impossibly, they know. Within 48 hours, arrangements were made for Amara to visit the remote village. The helicopter flight took 90 minutes, passing over endless green canopy before landing in a clearing surrounded by simple structures built in harmony with the forest. The village elders knew why she'd come. They'd been expecting this moment since the search helicopters had stopped circling overhead 2 years ago. They brought out a 7-year-old girl with sun-bleached blonde hair who spoke fluent Swahili and laughed with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd never known fear or trauma. Nia looked at Amara with curiosity but no recognition, or perhaps with recognition buried so deep it felt like a dream from another life. The elders explained their law. The child was Amara's by blood, but theirs by raising. They wouldn't prevent her from reclaiming her daughter, but they asked her to consider what Naya knew, what she needed, what life awaited her in a world of noise and concrete versus the forest that had become her home. Amara spent 3 days in the village, watching, learning, trying to reconcile memory with reality. She saw her daughter climb trees with gorilla-like agility, speak a language she didn't understand, eat foods she'd never heard of, live in a community bound by principles of sustainability and mutual care. She saw a child who was complete, whole, unburdened by the trauma of being lost because she'd never felt lost. She'd found a different family, a different purpose, a different belonging. On the 3rd day, Amara made the second most difficult decision of her life. She would remain connected to Naya, would visit regularly, would teach her about her origins and give her the choice to return if she ever wanted, but she wouldn't uproot this thriving child from the only home she remembered. She wouldn't prioritize her own need for redemption over her daughter's well-being. She told Naya about Kora, about the mother gorilla who taught her that love sometimes means letting go. She showed her daughter the photograph of Kora and baby Amara in their moment of reunion. And she explained, through a translator, that being a mother meant wanting what was best for your child even when it broke your heart to give it. Nia studied the photograph for a long time before asking. Through halting English, she was beginning to learn. "Are you my first mama or my second mama?" Amara answered, "I'm your always mama, even when we're apart, even when you can't see me. I'm watching from the trees like the gorilla mothers watch, and I'm proud of you." They embraced tentatively at first, then tighter, a connection reforming across the gap of years and lost memory. It wasn't the reunion Amara had dreamed of for 2 years. It was better. It was real. It was honest. It was love without possession, without demands, without the suffocating grip of someone who'd rather break something than risk losing it again. 6 months later, Amara returned to the Virunga Mountains, not as a photographer running from grief, but as someone who'd found purpose through the most unlikely teacher. She'd accepted a permanent position with Elena's Wildlife Protection Unit, documenting guerrilla troops, training rangers, and using her photographs to raise global awareness about conservation. The images from that expedition had become iconic. The moment of trust between Kora and Amara had been featured in major publications worldwide. The story had sparked international conversation about animal cognition, conservation ethics, and the complex emotional lives of great apes. Donations to gorilla protection programs had increased by 340%. Amara's work was saving hundreds of gorillas she would never meet. The Dalton trafficking network's collapse had created ripple effects across East Africa. 17 different poaching operations had been exposed and dismantled through investigations triggered by Marcus's arrest. Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda had enacted stronger wildlife protection laws. New ranger stations had been constructed. Communities that once relied on poaching had been provided with sustainable alternatives through ecotourism cooperatives. David Okonkwo's village, the poverty that had driven his betrayal, now operated one such cooperative, generating legitimate income while protecting the wildlife they'd once hunted. David worked there as a guide, his ranger certification reinstated after 2 years of community service and conservation education. He saw Amara occasionally when their paths crossed, and while they never spoke at length, they'd achieved an understanding. Desperation could drive anyone to terrible choices, but redemption required owning those choices completely. On a warm November morning, Amara made a pilgrimage to Kora's territory. She set up observation equipment at a respectful distance and waited. The troop emerged from the forest for their morning feeding. Bakari in the lead, several females following, and then Kora with a baby clinging to her chest. Baby Amara, now 10 months old, was thriving. Strong, curious, energetic, she played with juvenile troop members and explored her environment with the fearlessness of a healthy infant. The rangers monitoring the troop had documented her development, and every report confirmed what Amara had prayed for. The baby had suffered no lasting effects from those desperate early days. As Amara watched through her camera lens, Kora seemed to sense her presence. The gorilla turned, looking directly toward the observation point. Their eyes met across the distance, two mothers who'd each lost and found and learned to let go in ways that had transformed them both. Baby Amara approached the observation point, peering through the brush at the human with the camera. Then, mimicking the adult behavior she was learning, the infant beat her small chest. It was a gesture of strength, of vitality, of saying, "I'm here, I'm alive, I'm thriving." Amara laughed through tears, her heart simultaneously breaking and mending. She'd kept her promise. Against impossible odds, through violence and betrayal and near death, she'd returned a baby to its mother. She'd proven worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. Before leaving the observation point, Amara opened her silver locket and looked at the 2 photographs it now contained. On one side, 3-year-old Lily from her previous life. On the other, Kora and her baby in their moment of reunion. She carried them both now, 2 children, 2 mothers, 2 stories of love that transcended the need to possess. 3 months later, a package arrived at her Nairobi office. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in crayon drawings, stick figures of a woman and a girl holding hands, mountains, and trees in the background. At the bottom, in shaky English letters, "Thank you first, Mama. Love, Naya." Naya was learning English from the village teacher and had as Ked to send a message to the woman who'd visited from the outside world. She remembered, after all. Or perhaps she'd always known, carrying the knowledge in that deep place where children store truths they can't yet articulate. Amara framed the drawing and hung it beside her photograph of Kora and baby Amara. They told the same story from different angles, stories about mothers and daughters, about trust and sacrifice, about understanding that the greatest gift one can give to the loved is sometimes simply freedom. The mountain gorilla population continued its slow recovery. Anti-poaching efforts had reduced illegal hunting by 67% in the region. Tourist visits had increased, bringing revenue that funded both conservation and local communities. And every year, researchers added to humanity's understanding of these magnificent animals, documenting behaviors that challenged assumptions about intelligence, emotion, and the boundaries between human and animal experience. Amara continued her work, traveling between the jungle and the village, maintaining connections with both the daughter she'd lost and found, and the gorilla family that had taught her the most important lesson of her life. She photographed baby Amara's development, documented Naya's education, and slowly rebuilt her own identity as someone who carried grief without being consumed by it. She wrote an article that was published in National Geographic, closing with words that had become her philosophy: "In the wild, nothing belongs to us. Not the land, not the animals, not even our own children. They belong to themselves, to their futures, to the mysterious paths that life carves through jungle and time." A mother gorilla once gave me the gift of her trust. In return, I learned that love isn't about possession. It's about recognizing when to hold on and when the greatest act of love is letting go. Some bonds transcend species, language, even death, and sometimes the wild chooses us not to own, you to remember. The article sparked renewed interest in gorilla conservation and became required reading in primatology programs around the world. But for Amara, it was simpler than that. It was a thank you note to a gorilla who'd seen her grief and offered a chance at redemption. It was a love letter to a daughter who was thriving in the forest. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes the hardest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. Years would pass. Baby Amara would grow into an adult female, would eventually have her own offspring, would pass on whatever lessons she'd learned from those desperate early days when a human had kept her alive. Naya would grow too, would eventually choose whether to remain in the village or explore the outside world, would carry both cultures within her as she forged her own path. And Amara would continue her work, documenting the wild with eyes that had learned to see connection instead of separation, trust instead of control, love as liberation rather than possession. She would carry her locket always, looking at those two photographs and remembering that some gifts can never be repaid, only honored through how one chooses to live afterward. In the vast Virunga Mountains, beneath endless green canopy, life continued its ancient patterns. Gorillas raised their young, communities found sustainable ways to coexist with wildlife. And occasionally, very occasionally, humans and animals achieved moments of understanding that suggested the boundaries between species were far more permeable than anyone had imagined. The wild didn't need humans to save it. It needed humans to respect it, to learn from it, to recognize their place within it rather than above it. That was Kora's final gift to Amara, not just the survival of a baby, but the understanding that humans were never meant to own or control nature. They were meant to witness it, honor it, and sometimes, when the wild chose them, to serve it with everything they had. Amara had been chosen, she had served. And in doing so, she had found not the redemption she sought, but something better: peace with the uncontrollable, trust in the unknowable, and faith that love, in its truest form, always meant knowing when to hold on and when to let go. The gorilla's gift had been trust. Amara's gift in return was proving worthy of it. And that exchange, between two mothers who spoke no common language but understood each other perfectly, had changed both their worlds in ways that would echo for generations. The call came at 3 in the morning, the kind of hour when phones ringing meant death or disaster. Amara fumbled for her mobile in the darkness of her Nairobi apartment, knocking over a half-empty cup of tea that had gone cold hours earlier while she edited photographs. The voice on the other end belonged to Samuel Kipchoge, senior ranger at the Virunga Conservation Station, a man whose calm demeanor never cracked except in the most dire circumstances. His calm had cracked. "Amara, we have a situation with Kora's troop. You need to get here immediately. Bring your equipment." And Amara. He paused, and she could hear voices shouting in the background, the crackle of radio static, helicopter rotors warming up. "She's asking for you specifically." The statement made no logical sense. Gorillas didn't ask for people. They didn't request specific humans by name, but Amara didn't question it. She'd learned 4 years ago that Kora operated according to intelligence parameters that shattered conventional scientific understanding. If Samuel said Kora was asking for her, he meant it literally. 20 minutes later, Amara was in a jeep racing through pre-dawn darkness toward the airfield. The emergency helicopter pilot, a woman named Grace who'd flown extraction missions during the trafficking bust years earlier, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Baby Amara's injured," she said bluntly as they lifted off. "Poacher trap, steel cable snare caught her left leg above the ankle. She's been tangled for at least 6 hours based on blood loss patterns." Amara's stomach dropped. Baby Amara wasn't a baby anymore at 4 years old. She was an energetic juvenile who'd become something of a legend among primatologists. Her early survival story had made her a symbol of gorilla resilience. Researchers had documented her development obsessively, noting advanced problem-solving abilities and unusual curiosity about humans that they attributed to her early contact with Amara Thorne. "How bad?" Amara asked, already knowing the answer would devastate her. Grace's face and profile showed no emotion, but her knuckles were white on the controls. "The Rangers think she'll lose the foot, maybe the entire leg below the knee. The cable cut to bone and the circulation's been compromised too long. Even with veterinary intervention," she didn't finish the sentence. The helicopter raced over jungle canopy, turning gold with approaching sunrise. Through the window, Amara could see the vast expanse of territory Kora's troop called home territory that had been expanding as anti-poaching efforts proved successful, but which still held dangers that no amount of human vigilance could completely eliminate. "Where's Kora now?" Amara asked. "That's the problem," Grace replied. "She's with baby Amara at the snare site, won't let the Rangers approach. Bakari and 3 other females are forming a defensive perimeter. Every time the vet team tries to get close enough to tranquilize baby Amara, the troop charges. They're protecting her, but they're also preventing the medical intervention that could save her life." "How long before permanent damage becomes fatal?" "The vet estimates maybe 12 hours before sepsis or complete circulatory failure. But the real window's probably 6. After that, even amputation won't prevent systemic organ failure." Amara closed her eyes, seeing not the 4-year-old gorilla but the dying infant she'd cradled through that storm 4 years ago. She'd made a promise then, this baby wouldn't die. She'd kept that promise once, now she was being asked to keep it again. The helicopter touched down in a clearing 300 yards from the snare site. The ranger team had established a perimeter but maintained distance from the troop. Dr. Elena Reyes was there, still working with Interpol's wildlife unit, but spending increasing amounts of time on pure conservation research. She looked like she hadn't slept, her normally meticulous appearance disheveled. Her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and worry. "Thank God you're here," Elena said, gripping Amara's arm hard enough to bruise. "She's been vocalizing for hours. Samuel thinks she's calling for you specifically because the sounds match recordings of Kora's distress calls from 4 years ago. She remembers, Amara. She remembers you saved her baby before, and she's asking you to do it again." The implication settled over Amara like a weight. Kora had made another calculated gamble, another demonstration of abstract reasoning that would rewrite primate behavior textbooks. The gorilla was essentially saying, "This human proved trustworthy once, therefore this human can be trusted again." It was memory, pattern recognition, and faith combined into a decision that put her offspring's life in a stranger's hands. Samuel Kipchoge approached with a tablet showing thermal imaging of the snare site. Baby Amara appeared as a bright shape tangled in underbrush, her injured leg showing cooler temperatures indicating compromised blood flow. Around her, 5 adult gorillas maintained positions that formed a protective circle. They weren't aggressive, they were guarding, waiting, watching for something or someone specific. "We've tried everything," Samuel said, his voice hoarse from shouting commands through the night. Tranquilizer darts from distance, the mothers intercept them. Approaching with food, they ignore it. Dr. Mutumwa, our best wildlife vet, tried to sedate baby Amara with a pole syringe and nearly lost his arm when Bakari charged. "We're out of conventional options." "What's the unconventional option?" Amara asked, though she already knew the answer. "You walk in there unarmed, unprotected, and hope Kora lets you help. If she doesn't, if the troop perceives you as a threat." Samuel didn't need to finish. Everyone present had seen what mountain gorillas could do to perceived threats. Amara would be torn apart in seconds. Elena pulled Amara aside, away from the ranger's preparin. "Gee, emergency medical equipment. I can't officially endorse this," she said quietly. "As the Interpol liaison and senior researcher, I'm supposed to prioritize human safety and follow protocols. But unofficially, Her voice cracked slightly. "That baby is named after you. Kora gave you a gift 4 years ago. Now she's asking you to honor it. And I think you're the only person on this mountain who has any chance of succeeding." Amara looked toward the snare site, unable to see it through the dense vegetation, but feeling its pull like gravity. She thought about Naya, who was now 11 years old and still living primarily in the forest village, though she visited Amara regularly and had started attending a special school that integrated traditional education with indigenous knowledge. Their relationship had evolved into something neither fully mother-daughter nor fully mentor-student, but entirely its own category, a bond built on honesty about what had been lost and acceptance of what had been found. She thought about the locket she still wore, now containing 3 photographs: Lily from before, Naya from a visit 2 months ago, and baby Amara as an infant in Kora's arms. 3 children connected by impossible circumstances, and a woman who'd learned that motherhood sometimes meant protecting children who weren't biologically hers. "Give me the medical kit," Amara said. "The basic one: scalpel, antiseptic, bandages, pain medication measured for juvenile gorilla weight. Nothing that looks threatening." Dr. Mutumwa, the wildlife veterinarian, approached with a pack that looked more like a first aid kit than surgical equipment. "This is inadequate for what needs to happen," he said bluntly. "That cable needs to be cut with heavy wire cutters. The wound needs extensive debridement. She'll require antibiotics, probably surgery to remove necrotic tissue, and there's a strong chance the foot can't be saved regardless of intervention." "But this gives her a chance?" Amara asked. "A small one. If you can remove the snare and stabilize her enough for us to tranquilize from a distance, we might be able to extract her for emergency surgery." "Might. The odds aren't good." "Better than certain death in 6 hours?" Dr. Mutumwa's expression softened slightly. "Yes, marginally better." Amara walked toward the snare site with empty hands visible and no equipment except the small medical pack strapped to her waist. She moved slowly, stopping frequently, allowing the gorillas time to assess her, recognize her, decide whether she represented threat or help. Her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough that she wondered if the gorillas could hear, it could sense her fear and interpret it as dangerous instability. The vegetation opened into a small clearing where baby Amara lay tangled in undergrowth. The steel cable snare had caught her left leg mid-stride, the kind of trap designed to hold whatever stepped into it until poachers arrived to collect their prize. Baby Amara's struggles had only tightened the noose. The cable had cut through skin and muscle, exposing white bone beneath. Blood had soaked into the earth around her, dark and clotting. Her breathing came in short, pained gasps. But her eyes were alert. When she saw Amara, she made a sound, a whimper that held both recognition and plea, she remembered. 4 years of life and normal development, and she still remembered the human who'd carried her through a storm. Kora emerged from behind a massive tree trunk. The gorilla had aged visibly, silver spreading across her shoulders and back, her face showing the weathering of seasons and struggles. But her eyes held the same desperate intelligence they'd contained 4 years ago when she'd placed her dying infant in a stranger's hands. The moment held impossible weight. 2 mothers who'd communicated once across the barrier of species, now facing each other again with another life hanging in the balance. Kora vocalized low, rumbling, complex sounds that might have been greeting or warning or plea. Amara stood perfectly still, letting the gorilla make the decision. Then Kora did something that would later be analyzed frame by researchers around the world. She approached Amara, reached out with one massive hand, and touched the silver locket hanging around the human's neck. The gesture was unmistakable. She recognized the object, associated it with the previous crisis, understood its significance as a symbol of the bond they'd forged. Amara opened the locket, showing Kora the photograph of herself with baby Amara as an infant. The gorilla studied it for several seconds, her eyes moving between the photograph and the injured juvenile behind her. Then she stepped aside. Permission granted. Amara moved to baby Amara's side, kneeling in the blood-soaked earth. The juvenile gorilla's eyes tracked her movement, showing fear but also something else, trust inherited or taught or somehow transmitted across the years. Amara spoke softly, maintaining the same tone she'd used 4 years ago, narrating her actions as she examined the wound. The damage was catastrophic. The cable had cut through the Achilles tendon, severed major blood vessels, and fractured the tibia. The foot dangled at an unnatural angle, already showing signs of necrosis. No amount of field medicine would save it. The only question was whether baby Amara would survive the trauma of emergency amputation. Behind her, Amara heard movement. Bakari had approached to within 10 feet, close enough to charge and kill her in under 2 seconds. The silverback's presence was meant as supervision if Amara caused additional pain, increased distress, proved unworthy of the trust being extended. He would end the experiment immediately and permanently. Amara's hands shook as she opened the medical kit. She'd photographed injuries before, documented animal suffering, maintained professional detachment through scenes of natural cruelty that would haunt most people for years, but this was different. This was a child she'd saved once, named after her, connected to her by bonds that science couldn't quantify but that felt more real than kinship. She administered pain medication first, a calculated dose for baby Amara's weight, injected into the heavy muscle of her thigh. The juvenile flinched but didn't cry out. Within minutes, her breathing eased slightly, the rigid tension in her body softening as the drugs took effect. Then came the terrible necessity. Amara had wire cutters in the kit, heavy-duty tools designed for exactly this scenario. She positioned them carefully on the cable above where it had embedded in flesh, took a breath, and cut. The cable sprang apart with a sound like a gunshot. Baby Amara screamed a sound of pure agony that tore through the jungle and sent birds erupting from trees. Bakari roared in response, beating his chest, moving closer. Kora vocalized rapidly, a stream of sounds that might have been reassurance to her daughter or warning to Amara or both. But Amara kept working. She flushed the wound with antiseptic, causing another scream. She packed it with gauze soaked in antibiotic solution, wrapping the mangled limb as securely as she could without causing additional damage. She worked with the mechanical precision of someone who couldn't afford to acknowledge the emotional weight of what she was doing, couldn't think about the parallels to Lily's disappearance, to Naya's recovery, to all the children she'd failed to save or saved imperfectly or learned to love despite not being able to keep them. Baby Amara's screams gradually subsided into whimpers. The pain medication was working, or perhaps she was simply exhausted beyond the capacity to express more suffering. She looked at Amara with eyes that held confusion, pain, betrayal at being hurt by someone she'd trusted, but also something else, understanding, maybe, that the hurt had been necessary. Amara stood. Slowly, her hands covered in blood, her entire body trembling from adrenaline crash. She looked at Kora and made a gesture toward the ranger perimeter, a question. "The baby needs more help than I can give. Will you let the others approach?" Kora studied her for a long moment. Then the gorilla moved to baby Amara's side, examined the bandaged leg, and made a decision that demonstrated reasoning that would be debated in scientific journals for years. She picked up her daughter gently, supporting the injured leg, and began walking toward the ranger perimeter. The gorilla was trusting humans not just to help, but to take her offspring away for intervention she couldn't observe or control. It was faith on a scale that transcended instinct or training. It was the kind of calculated risk that only a mind capable of abstract reasoning, memory, and hope could make. The ranger team stood frozen in shock as Kora approached their perimeter carrying baby Amara. Dr. Mutamwa recovered first, moving forward with a loaded tranquilizer dart in steady hands. He needed to sedate baby Amara for transport, and he needed to do it without spooking Kora into defensive action. He knelt 20 feet from the gorilla and displayed the dart, showing it clearly, making no sudden movements. Then he mimicked an injection motion against his own arm, demonstrating what would happen. Incredibly, Kora seemed to understand. She held baby Amara steady as Dr. Mutamwa approached, administered the sedative with a pulse syringe, and stepped back quickly. Within 90 seconds, baby Amara's eyes grew heavy. Within 3 minutes, she was unconscious. Kora continued holding her daughter, supporting her weight even as the juvenile went limp. The mother's face, if gorilla faces could be read through human emotional frameworks, showed something that looked heartbreakingly like anguish. Dr. Mutamwa brought a stretcher forward. 4 rangers positioned themselves to receive baby Amara's weight, and then came the moment that would be captured on a dozen cameras and would become one of the most powerful images of human-animal cooperation ever recorded. Kora gently, reverently, placed her unconscious daughter onto the stretcher. The gorilla stepped back. Bakari and the other troop members emerged from the tree line, forming a semicircle that watched without interfering as humans loaded baby Amara into a transport crate. The entire scene had the quality of ceremony, solemn, significant, a conscious transfer of responsibility from one species to another based purely on trust earned through past actions. Before the Rangers lifted the crate, Amara approached Kora one final time. She opened her locket again, showing the photograph, then pointed to herself and then toward where the helicopter waited. "I will go with her. I will stay with her. I promise." Kora reached out and touched Amara's face, the same gesture she'd made 4 years ago in a different storm, under different circumstances, offering a different child. The gentleness was devastating. Then the gorilla turned and walked back into the jungle, her troop following, leaving their future in human hands. The helicopter flight to the advanced veterinary facility in Kigali felt eternal. Baby Amara lay unconscious in her transport crate, her breathing shallow but steady, her injured leg a horror show of torn flesh and shattered bone. Dr. Matumwa worked throughout the flight, establishing an IV line, administering fluids and antibiotics, monitoring vitals that remained dangerously unstable. "She's crashing," he said 15 minutes into the flight, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Baby Amara's heart rate had dropped precipitously, her breathing had become irregular, her body temperature was plummeting despite heated blankets. They were losing her. Amara found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, praying. Not to any specific deity, but to the universe, to fate, to whatever force had orchestrated the impossible connections that had brought her to this moment. She prayed with the same desperation she'd felt searching for Lily, with the same intensity she'd experienced holding a dying infant gorilla during a storm, with the same fierce love that had allowed her to let Naya go rather than force her into a life she didn't choose. Dr. Matumwa injected stimulants directly into baby Amara's heart. He forced oxygen through a pediatric mask adapted for gorilla anatomy. He compressed her chest with careful precision, manually supporting a heart that had decided dying was easier than fighting. Her vitals stabilized barely, precariously, hanging by threads that could snap with any additional stress. But stabilized. She was still alive when the helicopter touched down at the facility, still alive when they rushed her into emergency surgery. Still alive 3 hours later when Dr. Matumwa emerged from the operating room looking like he'd aged a decade. "We had to amputate below the knee," he said without preamble. "The damage was too extensive, the necrosis too advanced. But she's alive. She survived the surgery. She's got a fighting chance now." Elena, who'd flown in separately and had been pacing the waiting area for hours, collapsed into a chair with a sound between a laugh and a sob. Samuel gripped Amara's shoulder hard enough to hurt. Grace, the helicopter pilot, wiped her eyes quickly and pretended to check equipment. Amara felt nothing. Or rather, she felt too much relief and grief and terror and hope all colliding until they canceled each other out into numb static. She'd saved baby Amara again, but at what cost? A juvenile gorilla who'd lost her foot, who would face the jungle's brutal environment with a permanent disability, who might not survive despite all their intervention. "What are her chances?" Amara asked, and baby Amara's heart decided to fight anyway, in the wild I mean, with 3 functional limbs instead of 4. Dr. Matumwa considered his answer carefully. "In a normal troop, under normal circumstances, maybe 30% chance of surviving to adulthood. She'll be slower, more vulnerable to predators, less capable of climbing to escape danger. But," he paused, choosing words that carried scientific weight, "this isn't a normal troop. Kora has demonstrated sophisticated protective behaviors. Bakari leads a stable social structure, and baby Amara herself has shown remarkable resilience. I wouldn't bet on most 3-limbed juveniles, but I'd bet on her." They allowed Amara into recovery after baby Amara regained consciousness from anesthesia. The juvenile gorilla lay in a specialized enclosure that mimicked natural nest conditions, her amputated limb wrapped in bandages, her eyes unfocused and confused. She made soft, distressed sounds, not screams of pain, but whimpers of disorientation, of being in an unfamiliar place, of missing her mother. Amara sat beside the enclosure and did what she'd done 4 years earlier. She talked. She narrated what had happened, explained the injury and the surgery in words the gorilla couldn't understand but might find soothing through tone and rhythm. She described how Kora had trusted humans again, had made another impossible gamble on compassion. She promised that baby Amara would return to her mother, would go home, would be given every possible chance to thrive despite her disability. She showed the locket again, the photograph of mother and infant reunited after crisis. A reminder that they'd survived before, that trust had been rewarded. That love sometimes required enduring terrible pain for the possibility of better futures. Baby Amara's eyes focused on Amara's face. For several heartbeats, juvenile gorilla and middle-aged human simply looked at each other, connected by circumstances that defied probability and bound by promises that transcended language. Then baby Amara reached through the enclosure bars with her right hand and touched Amara's face, the same gesture her mother Ha.D. made twice. A learned behavior passed down, a symbol of trust inherited across generations, a communication that said, "I know you, I remember, I understand." Amara broke. 4 years of professional composure, of maintaining boundaries between documenter and subject, of pretending she was simply a photographer who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time, all of it shattered. She wept openly, her face pressed against the enclosure bars, her hand holding baby Amara's through the metal. Elena found her an hour later, still there, still crying, still holding hands with a gorilla who'd fallen asleep mid-contact. The primatologist didn't say anything. She simply sat beside Amara and waited, offering silent companionship through a grief that wasn't about loss, but about the terrible weight of love, the responsibility of being trusted, the burden of trying to honor faith placed in imperfect hands, the crushing reality that saving someone once didn't guarantee the ability to save them forever. Baby Amara remained at the facility for 3 weeks. The surgical site healed remarkably well with no signs of infection despite initial concerns. Physical therapists worked with her daily, teaching her to redistribute weight across 3 limbs, to navigate obstacles with modified climbing techniques, to build compensatory muscle strength. She proved to be a determined patient, motivated by a drive to return to familiar territory that overrode any depression or resignation. During those 3 weeks, Amara visited daily, maintaining the connection that had become somehow essential to both of them. She documented baby Amara's recovery with her camera, capturing images of resilience that would eventually become part of a fundraising campaign for expanded veterinary services in gorilla territory. But more importantly, she simply sat with her, offering presence, consistency, proof that the trust extended during crisis hadn't been temporary convenience but genuine commitment. Naya visited once, making the long journey from her forest village with her adoptive grandmother. The 11-year-old studied baby Amara with the serious intensity she brought to all new experiences, asking questions in the mixture of Swahili and English that had become her primary language. She wanted to know if the gorilla's mother had felt the same things when giving up her baby that Naya's first mama had felt. She wanted to understand if animals could make choices based on hope rather than instinct. Amara answered honestly, "Yes, I think mothers of all kinds can recognize when love means letting go. When the best thing you can do for your child is trust someone else to give them what you can't provide yourself." Naya absorbed this in silence, then asked, "Do you think baby Amara will remember being here? Will she remember that you helped her?" "I think," Amara said carefully, "that memory is complicated. She might not remember the details, but she'll remember the feeling of being safe when she was in pain, of being cared for when she was afraid. Just like you might not remember Colorado, but you remember feeling loved." The girl considered this, then moved closer to baby Amara's enclosure. She began humming a melody her village used during healing ceremonies. Baby Amara's ears perked up, her attention drawn to the unfamiliar but soothing sound. For several minutes, injured gorilla and adopted human child simply existed in shared space, both of them proof that survival sometimes required accepting help from unexpected sources. Before leaving, Naya asked one more question. "If baby Amara's mother trusted you, does that mean she's like your daughter too? Do you have 2 daughters now?" The question struck deeper than the child likely intended. Amara thought about biological connection versus chosen bonds, about the families we're born into versus the ones we build through shared crisis and sustained commitment. She thought about how her identity as a mother had been shattered and then reformed into something that didn't fit conventional categories. She was first mama to a child being raised by others. She was the human connection for a gorilla who bore her name. She was Elena's friend and colleague. She was witness and guardian and documenter and advocate all at once. "I think," she said finally, "that I have many children now. All the ones I've helped protect, all the ones I photograph and monitor and care about. Being a mother isn't just about who gave birth. It's about who you'd risk everything for, who you'd walk into danger to save, who you promise things to that you're terrified you can't deliver on. Naya nodded solemnly, understanding in the way children sometimes do when adults are trying to articulate truths they haven't fully processed themselves. Then she hugged Amara, brief and fierce, before returning to her grandmother's side for the long journey home. The decision about when to return baby Amara to the wild sparked intense debate among the veterinary and conservation teams. The purely medical perspective argued for keeping her in protective custody indefinitely, ensuring her survival through controlled environment and continued treatment. The conservation perspective argued for immediate release, trusting Kora's demonstrated intelligence to adapt to her daughter's disability while prioritizing the gorilla's psychological well-being over physical security. Amara argued for a third option, a gradual reintroduction that allowed Kora and baby Amara to reunite under observation, giving the troop time to adjust and giving humans time to intervene if the disability proved insurmountable in natural conditions. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely but offended no one enough to reject outright. 6 weeks after the amputation, they transported baby Amara back to Virunga territory. The juvenile had adapted remarkably to three-limbed locomotion, not as fast as she'd been before, not as agile in complex climbing, but functional to navigate basic territory. She'd gained weight, her overall health had stabilized, and most importantly, she'd shown consistent behaviors indicating she wanted to return home facing toward familiar territory, responding positively to audio recordings of her troops' vocalizations, showing agitation when kept from open spaces. The reunion was orchestrated carefully. Rangers had been monitoring Kora's troop continuously, tracking their movements, ensuring they remained within accessible territory. The team selected a clearing the troop frequented for midday rest, set up observation posts at respectful distance, and waited for the gorillas to arrive on their normal schedule. When the troop entered the clearing, the Rangers released baby Amara from her transport crate. What happened next would be studied for years as possibly the most complex demonstration of animal emotion and cognition ever recorded in wild primates. Baby Amara stood at the clearing's edge for almost a full minute, scanning for familiar faces. Then she saw Kora and screamed not in pain or fear but in recognition, joy, desperate relief. She limped forward, her gait awkward but determined, moving as fast as 3 limbs could carry her. Kora charged toward her daughter with similar intensity, closing the distance in seconds. Mother and daughter collided in an embrace that looked completely, unmistakably human, arms wrapped around each other, faces pressed together, sounds of reunion that transcended species boundaries. They stayed that way for nearly 5 minutes, just holding each other, reconnecting after separation that had violated every instinct demanding they never be apart. Then Kora did something extraordinary. She stepped back, examined baby Amara's amputated limb carefully, and looked directly toward where Amara stood at the observation post. The gorilla's expression, if human emotional frameworks could be applied to gorilla faces, showed something that looked like gratitude, grief, and acceptance all mixed together. She'd gotten her daughter back, but not unchanged. The price of survival had been permanent loss. Bakari approached next, sniffing baby Amara thoroughly, checking her from multiple angles. The silverback examined the amputation site with what appeared to be careful attention, then looked toward the human observation post with an expression that primatologists would later categorize as evaluative assessment. He was determining whether baby Amara's return was a gift or a curse, whether humans had saved her or simply prolonged her suffering. The answer came from baby Amara herself. After greeting her mother and Bakari, she attempted to join 2 juvenile troop members who were playing in nearby trees. Her first climbing attempt failed. She couldn't distribute weight properly, couldn't grip with a foot that no longer existed, fell after reaching only 6 feet up the trunk. She tried again. Failed again. The other juveniles watched with expressions that might have been curiosity or concern. Kora vocalized low, rumbling sounds that might have been encouragement or warning. On the 3rd attempt, baby Amara succeeded. She adapted her technique, using upper body strength to compensate for the missing limb, hooking her right leg differently to provide stability, finding a method that worked despite permanent disability. She reached a sturdy branch 15 feet up and sat there for a moment, looking down at her troop with something that looked remarkably like pride. The other gorillas erupted in what researchers later described as celebratory vocalizations. Kora beat her chest. Bakari made sounds of approval. Even the juveniles who'd been watching critically joined the chorus. The troop was accepting baby Amara back, not despite her disability, but with full recognition of it, acknowledging what had changed. While celebrating what remained, Amara watched through binoculars with tears streaming down her face for the second time in 6 weeks. She'd promised Kora that baby Amara would come home. She'd delivered on that promise. But the real miracle wasn't medical intervention or human compassion. It was Kora's troop demonstrating the kind of inclusive acceptance that humans claim to value but often failed to practice. Over the following weeks, researchers documented how the troop adapted to baby Amara's disability. Kora maintained closer proximity than normal for a 4-year-old juvenile, intervening when climbing became too dangerous, providing support during difficult terrain. Bakari adjusted the troop's travel routes to avoid areas requiring complex 4-limbed navigation. The other gorillas slowed their pace, waited when baby Amara fell behind, and showed patience that suggested conscious accommodation rather than coincidental alignment. Baby Amara herself proved remarkably adaptable. She developed compensatory techniques for every major activity: climbing, foraging, grooming, playing. She couldn't move as fast as other juveniles, couldn't reach certain food sources, couldn't escape danger with the same speed. But she was alive, integrated into her family, learning and growing despite permanent limitations. She also maintained an unusual relationship with humans. While other troop members exhibited normal wariness of human presence, baby Amara showed consistent interest in the researchers monitoring her progress. She approached observation posts, studied cameras and equipment, and seemed to recognize Amara specifically when the photographer visited, responding with vocalizations researchers interpreted as friendly greeting rather than territorial warning. Elena theorized that baby Amara had been cognitively imprinted during her 2 early life crisis interventions, forming associations between humans and safety that overrode natural caution. It was unprecedented behavior, or in wild gorillas, raising questions about how trauma and rescue might reshape neural pathways related to threat assessment and social bonding. But Amara wondered if it was something else, if baby Amara understood, with whatever framework gorilla cognition used to process complex information, that she owed her life to human intervention twice. If she carried gratitude, or recognition of debt, or simply memory that these particular primates had proven trustworthy when trust was desperately needed. 6 months after baby Amara's return to the wild, National Geographic published Amara's photo essay documenting the entire journey from the snare injury through surgery, rehabilitation, and reintegration. The images were powerful. Baby Amara's mangled leg in the snare, Kora placing her unconscious daughter on a stretcher, the juvenile learning to climb with 3 limbs, the moment of reunion between mother and daughter. But the most impactful image, the one that would win awards and be featured in conservation campaigns worldwide, was simpler. It showed baby Amara sitting on a tree branch, silhouetted against sunset, her profile clearly showing the amputated limb. But she wasn't alone. Kora sat beside her, one arm around her daughter's shoulders, both of them looking toward the horizon. The caption Amara wrote read, "Survival is not the same as thriving. But sometimes, with support, understanding, and love that transcends normal boundaries, survival becomes the foundation for something more, for resilience, adaptation, and proof that families of all kinds can accommodate loss while celebrating what remains." 3 months after the National Geographic publication, Amara received a message from an unexpected source, Marcus Dalton, the trafficker she'd helped imprison 5 years earlier. He was writing from a Kenyan prison where he was serving concurrent sentences totaling 23 years. His message was brief, cryptic, and deeply unsettling. "Ms. Thorne, I have information about your daughter's disappearance that you need to hear. Information that will change everything you think you understand about what happened in Colorado. I'll only discuss it in person. Come alone. You owe yourself this truth." Amara's first instinct was to ignore it. Marcus was a manipulator, a man who'd built an empire on exploiting vulnerability and desperation. Whatever he claimed to know was likely fabrication designed to extract some advantage: reduced sentence through cooperation, transferred to better facility, simple entertainment from causing pain. But the message had been specific: your daughter's disappearance, not Naya's recovery or baby Amara's rehabilitation, the original trauma that had broken Amara's life apart 5 years ago. Marcus shouldn't have known those details. The trafficking operation had been focused on animals, not missing children, unless... Amara sat with the message for 3 days, reading it obsessively, analyzing every word for hidden meaning or obvious manipulation. She consulted Elena, who advised caution. She showed it to Samuel, who recommended ignoring it entirely. She even mentioned it to Patricia, her editor, who warned that engaging with Marcus could compromise Amara's credibility and safety. But on the 4th day, Amara found herself sitting across from Marcus Dalton in a prison visitor's room, separated by scratched plexiglass that made his face appear distorted and ghost-like. He'd aged dramatically, his expensive safari confidence replaced by prison pallor, his body thinner, his eyes holding the haunted quality of someone who'd had years to contemplate the wreckage of their choices. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said, his voice tinny through the communication speaker. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm here for 60 seconds, Amara replied coldly. "Say what you need to say or I'm leaving." Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting into something that looked almost like genuine regret. 5 years ago, my trafficking net. Orc wasn't just moving animals. We had associated operations, diversified revenue streams. One of those operations involved coordinating with individuals who facilitated adoptions for wealthy clients who didn't want to deal with legal scrutiny or waiting periods. Amara's blood went cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that in 2020, one of my associates, a man named Julian Voss, who specialized in procurement logistics, was working in Colorado. He had connections with the forest village where your daughter was found. He was the intermediary who brought certain children to that community, children who'd been reported as lost or dead but were actually being relocated for clients who paid premium prices for untraceable adoptions." The room spun. Amara gripped the table edge to keep herself upright. "You're telling me Lily was kidnapped, that her disappearance wasn't an accident?" "I'm telling you that Julian Voss was in Rocky Mountain National Park the day your daughter vanished. I'm telling you that he had a client, a wealthy couple from Dubai, who specifically wanted a young blonde girl. And I'm telling you that he delivered on that contract." Marcus's voice held no triumph, only exhaustion. "The forest village wasn't part of it originally. That's where the plan broke down." Amara couldn't breathe. The entire foundation of her grief, her guilt, her understanding of the worst day of her life was collapsing. "What happened?" Marcus sighed, looking older than his 58 years. "Voss grabbed your daughter during that 30 seconds you were focused on your camera. He had a vehicle staged, started transporting her toward the planned handoff point. But something went wrong. Mechanical failure, I think, or maybe he got spooked by the search helicopters. He panicked, drove off route, and ended up breaking down near the forest village. The elders took her in," Amara whispered, pieces assembling into a picture so different from what she'd believed. "Voss tried to retrieve her, but the village had already integrated her into their community. He couldn't extract her without drawing attention, couldn't report the situation without exposing the entire operation. So he disappeared, left her there, told his clients the acquisition had failed." Marcus's hands trembled slightly. "I found out about it 3 years later when Julian got sloppy with another job and needed bail money. He told me the whole story while drunk, thought it was funny that a high-paying contract had been screwed up by a broken fuel pump and some tree huggers who took in strays." "Why are you telling me this now?" Amara demanded, her voice shaking with fury. "Why not 5 years ago? Why not during your trial?" "Because 5 years ago, I was still protecting my network. I was planning appeals, hoping for reduced sentences, trying to minimize damage." Marcus looked directly at her, and his expression held something that might have been genuine remorse. "But I've had 5 years to think about what I built, what I facilitated, who got hurt. I've had 5 years to understand that the only thing I can do now is provide truth to people who deserve it, even if that truth comes too late to change anything." Amara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against linoleum. "Where is Julian Voss now?" "Dead. Died 18 months ago in a car accident in Namibia. But his records still exist, digital files, client lists, operational logs. I know where they're stored. I can give you access." Marcus pulled out a folded piece of paper that had been approved by prison security. "These are the passwords and server locations." You'll find documentation of your daughter's kidnapping, the intended buyers, everything. And what do you want in exchange? Amara asked bitterly. Reduced sentence? Transfer? Public redemption? Marcus shook his head slowly. Nothing. I've got 2 decades left in here, and I've accepted that. My wife divorced me, my children won't speak to me, I've lost everything that mattered. This isn't about redemption, it's about making sure you know the truth. Your daughter didn't disappear because you were distracted by a camera. She was taken by a professional who'd done it before and would have done it again if not for mechanical failure and luck. That doesn't absolve me of... It doesn't absolve anyone of anything, Marcus interrupted. You still lost her. I still facilitated the network that enabled her kidnapping. We're all complicit in different ways. But you deserve to know that the guilt you've carried for 5 years was built on a false foundation. You didn't fail as a mother by taking a photograph. You were targeted by criminals, and your daughter was saved by people who had nothing to do with your choices. Amara took the paper, folded it carefully, and walked toward the exit. At the door, she paused without turning back. Why did you really contact me, Marcus? Of all the people you hurt, all the damage you caused, why me? His answer came quietly, barely audible through the speaker. Because when I saw you walk onto that bridge to save a gorilla baby, I realized something. You risked your life for a promise you'd made to a wild animal. You operated on principle even when it was suicidal. And I spent my entire life doing the opposite. I built an empire on exploiting trust, on treating living things as commodities. Watching you honor trust from a gorilla while I was built on betraying trust from everyone, it broke something in me, made me see what I'd become. Amara left without responding, but she took the paper with her. The digital files Marcus had directed her to were extensive, meticulously documented, and damning across multiple operations. Julian Voss had kept records of everything: client names, payment transfers, operational timelines, photographs of merchandise before and after acquisition. It was the kind of documentation that criminals kept as insurance against partners who might betray them, never are imagining it would survive their death and be used against them posthumously. The file on Lily was heartbreaking in its clinical detail. Photographs of 3-year-old Lily from before her disappearance, likely taken from Amara's own social media. A client dossier for the Dubai couple who'd commissioned her kidnapping, including their specifications: female, ages 2-4, blonde, healthy, no distinguishing marks or disabilities. Timeline logs showing Julian's surveillance of Amara's family in the days before the hiking trip. And finally, brief notes about the acquisition failure when mechanical problems had forced him to abandon the contract. Amara brought the evidence to federal authorities, who launched an immediate investigation. The Dubai couple was located and arrested, though they would fight extradition for years. Julian's broader client list triggered multiple international investigations, leading to arrests across 4 continents. The scale of the operation was staggering. Over 200 children had been trafficked through Julian's network over a 15-year period, many of them still unaccounted for. But for Amara, the most devastating revelation was simpler. She hadn't failed Lily. Her 30 seconds of distraction hadn't caused her daughter's disappearance. A professional criminal had targeted them deliberately, had planned the kidnapping methodically, had executed it during that brief moment because he'd been watching for exactly that opportunity. The guilt she'd carried for 5 years, the crushing weight of believing she'd destroyed her family through carelessness, transformed into something different. Rage at the men who'd built an industry on stolen children, grief for all the families who'd never gotten answers, and a strange, disorienting form of relief that coexisted with continued pain. She'd been a good mother whose child was taken, not a neglectful mother whose child wandered away. She visited Naya 2 weeks after learning the truth, making the journey to the forest village with a heart full of conflicting emotions she didn't know how to express. The 11-year-old had grown taller, her movements more confident, her integration into village life complete in ways that made Amara's heart ache with pride and loss. They sat together beneath the massive fig tree at the village center, and Amara explained what she'd learned carefully, in language Naya could understand. When Amara finished, the girl asked a single question: "Does it change anything? Does knowing that bad men took me change who I am now? Does it change that these people," she gestured toward the village around them, "saved me and raised me and gave me a home? Does it change that you're my first mama who lets me choose my own path?" Amara realized with sudden clarity that Naya understood something profound that she was still struggling to grasp. The circumstances of trauma mattered less than what was built from the wreckage. Lily had been kidnapped rather than lost, but she'd still ended up in a village that had loved her. Amara had been targeted by criminals rather than careless, but her daughter had still vanished for 2 years. The truth changed the story's beginning, but not its outcome. "What do you mean?" Amara asked. "No," Amara said finally. "It doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change that you're loved. It doesn't change that you get to choose your future." Naya nodded, satisfied. Then she asked, "Does it change who you are?" The question struck deeper than the child probably intended. Did it change who Amara was? The guilt had shaped her for 5 years, had driven her to Africa, had led her to Kora and baby Amara, had transformed her entire life trajectory. If she removed the guilt, did the rest of her transformation still hold meaning? "I think," Amara said slowly, "it changes the story I tell myself, but it doesn't change what I learned from the pain. I still needed to learn about trust and letting go and loving without possessing. The lessons were real even if the cause was different than I thought." Naya considered this with the gravity she brought to all important matters. Then she said something that sounded like wisdom beyond her years, though Amara would later realize it was simply the practical philosophy of a child raised in a community that valued acceptance over judgment. "Mama Elena says that gorillas don't think about why things happen. They just think about what to do next. Maybe humans should be more like gorillas sometimes." Amara laughed, genuine, cathartic laughter that released some of the tension she'd been carrying since Marcus's revelation. "Maybe we should," she agreed. Before leaving the village, Naya gave Amara a gift, a braided bracelet made from plant fibers, dyed in natural colors, woven in patterns that held meaning in the village's tradition. She explained that each color represented something: green for growth, brown for earth, white for truth, red for blood connections that transcended biology. "You wear this," Naya said, tying it around Amara's wrist, "and you remember, you're my first mama. Not because you gave birth to me, not because we share blood, but because you chose to let me be who I need to be. That's what makes you mama." Amara wore the bracelet constantly after that, alongside her silver locket. 2 symbols of motherhood, redefined not through biology or possession, but through trust, release, and honoring the autonomy of those we love. 8 months after Marcus's revelation, Amara returned to the Virunga Mountains for what had become her quarterly monitoring visit to track baby Amara's progress. The now 5-year-old gorilla had adapted remarkably to 3-limbed life, developing strength and techniques that compensated for her disability. She remained smaller than peers, slower in certain activities, but fully integrated into the troop's social structure. But this visit revealed something unexpected. Baby Amara had become a teacher. The researchers monitoring the troop had noticed that when younger juveniles struggled with climbing techniques or complex problems, baby Amara demonstrated alternative approaches. She showed them how to use upper body strength to compensate for weak grips, how to redistribute weight for better balance, how to assess risks more carefully before committing to difficult maneuvers. She'd essentially become the troop's specialist in adaptive problem solving. More remarkably, Kora had given birth again a healthy male infant named Django, who was now 6 months old. And baby Amara had taken an unusually active role in helping care for her younger brother, demonstrating behaviors typically seen only in adult females. She carried Django when Kora needed to forage, groomed him with surprising gentleness, and protected him from the rougher juvenile play that might injure a baby. Elena, observing alongside Amara, was documenting everything with the intense focus that had made her reputation. "This is unprecedented," she murmured, filming baby Amara carefully supporting Django while climbing a low tree branch. "Juvenile gorillas don't typically show this level of alloparenting behavior." She's essentially functioning as a secondary caregiver, which suggests sophisticated understanding of family roles and responsibilities. "Or she remembers being helped when she was vulnerable," Amara said quietly, "and she's paying it forward." Elena lowered her camera to look at Amara directly. "You know I hate anthropomorphizing. Attributing human emotional frameworks to animal behavior is scientifically problematic and sometimes," Amara interrupted gently, "it's accurate. Sometimes animals experience things that look like gratitude or remembrance or reciprocity because those things aren't unique. Ely human. They're mammalian. They're primate. They're what happens when social creatures with complex brains build relationships based on trust and repeated positive interactions. Elena considered this, her scientific skepticism warring with 5 years of observing Kora's troop demonstrate behaviors that continually challenged established models. Finally, she said, even if you're right, even if baby Amara is experiencing something analogous to gratitude or learned altruism, it doesn't change the fact that her disability has permanently limited her possibilities. She'll never lead a troop. She'll likely never reproduce successfully. She'll always be more vulnerable than her peers. Is that worse than being dead? Amara asked bluntly, because those were the options, 3-limbed life or no life. We gave her the only choice that included a future, and she's built something meaningful from it. Isn't that enough? The question hung in the air between them, touching on debates that extended far beyond one gorilla's rehabilitation. How much intervention was appropriate in wild populations? When did saving individual animals undermine natural selection's role in species health? Where was the line between compassionate conservation and humans imposing their values on ecosystems that functioned according to different principles? Before Elena could respond, Kora emerged from the undergrowth directly in front of their observation blind. The gorilla rarely approached humans deliberately anymore, having returned to normal wariness after baby Amara's reintegration. But today she walked straight toward their position, moving with the purposeful intensity that Amara had learned to recognize as intentional communication. Kora stopped 15 feet away, made direct eye contact with Amara, and did something that would be analyzed and debated by primatologists for years. She placed her hand over her own heart, then pointed toward Amara, then gestured toward where baby Amara was carrying. For Django, the sequence was unmistakable. I, you, my children, a statement of connection, acknowledgement, gratitude, or whatever the gorilla equivalent of those concepts might be. Then Kora turned and walked back to her family, the moment complete. Amara sat frozen, tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time in 5 years of knowing this gorilla. Elena's cameras had captured everything, documentation that would become part of the most comprehensive study of gorilla cognition and interspecies communication ever conducted. That looked, Elena said slowly, her scientific caution cracking slightly, like a gorilla saying thank you. Which should be impossible, which I will have difficulty publishing without being accused of projection and anthropomorphization. But which I'm fairly certain just happened. Kora's been doing impossible things since the day I met her, Amara replied, wiping her eyes. Maybe it's time we expanded our definitions of what's possible. That evening, back at the research station, Amara received a video call from Nia. The 12-year-old was excited about something, talking rapidly in Swahili before remembering to switch to English for Amara's benefit. She'd been accepted into a special program that combined traditional forest education with modern scientific training, a pilot initiative designed to prepare indigenous youth for careers in conservation that honored both their cultural knowledge and contemporary research methods. I want to study gorillas like you and Mama Elena, Nia said, her face glowing with enthusiasm. I want to help protect them and understand them and teach other people why they matter. Is that okay? I know you never told me what to do with my life, but I wanted you to know I chose this because of the stories you told me about baby Amara and Kora. Amara's heart felt simultaneously too large and too small, swelling with pride while aching with the knowledge that she'd missed so much of Nia's childhood, the years that had transformed her from a lost toddler into this brilliant, purposeful young woman. It's more than okay, Amara said, her voice thick with emotion. It's perfect. You'll be amazing at it. You already understand things about living in balance with nature that most scientists spend decades trying to learn. Will you help me? Nia asked. Will you teach me about cameras and research and how to tell stories that make people care about protecting wild places? Yes, Amara promised without hesitation. Absolutely yes. After the call ended, Elena found Amara sitting outside the research station, looking up at stars that blazed with intensity only visible far from human light pollution. The primatologist sat beside her in comfortable silence before saying, "Your daughter wants to follow in your footsteps." That must feel complicated. Everything about my relationship with Nia feels complicated, Amara admitted. I'm proud of her. I'm grieving the years I missed. I'm grateful she had the village. I'm still angry about the kidnapping. I want to be her mother, but I know I'm not really, not in the way that counts for daily life. It's all true at the same time. Like baby Amara, Elena observed. Saved but diminished. Alive but limited. Better off than dead but not the same, as if nothing had happened. Amara turned to look at her friend. Is that how you see it? That we diminished baby Amara by saving her? Elena was quiet for a long time, weighing her words with the precision she brought to scientific papers. Finally, she said, I think we changed her trajectory in ways that had both costs and benefits. We removed her from one path, the natural one, where she probably would have died, and placed her on another path that's viable but different than it would have been. Whether that's better or worse depends on the framework you use for evaluation. And what framework do you use? Amara pressed. Increasingly, Elena said slowly, as if admitting so. Mething she'd been reluctant to acknowledge, I use the framework of individual experience over population statistics. Baby Amara is experiencing life complex, social, meaningful life filled with relationships and learning and purpose. She's contributing to her troop's success in unique ways. She's teaching younger gorillas. She's helping raise her brother. Those experiences have value regardless of whether they align with natural selection's usual patterns. So you're saying we did the right thing? I'm saying, Elena corrected, that right is probably the wrong question. We did what compassion demanded in that moment. We made choices based on trust that had been extended to us. We honored a relationship that crossed species boundaries. Whether those choices align with optimal conservation strategy is a different question than whether they aligned with the ethical demands of the specific situation. It was the closest Elena had ever come to admitting that science couldn't answer every question, that sometimes decisions had to be made in the messy intersection of ethics, emotion, and incomplete information. They sat together in silence, watching the stars. This wasn't the Kanda brothers that network had been dismantled. These were newer operators, less sophisticated but equally dangerous, responding to continued demand from exotic animal markets that never seemed to completely disappear. Samuel Kipchoge called an emergency meeting of the conservation team, his expression grim. We found 6 snare traps in the past 24 hours, all along routes that Kora's troop uses regularly. The poachers are. Specifically targeting this troop, we found surveillance cameras hidden in trees, documenting the guerrillas' movements and patterns. Why this troop specifically? One of the rangers asked. There are larger troops with more valuable silverbacks. Samuel pulled up photographs on his tablet, and Amara's blood ran cold. The surveillance images showed baby Amara clearly, her 3-limbed gait distinctive and unmistakable. The photos were marked with annotations in a language Amara didn't recognize, but the intent was clear. This gorilla was being targeted deliberately. Rethink, Samuel said carefully, that baby Amara's story has made her valuable in a different way. The famous gorilla who survived amputation, who was saved by human intervention, who became a symbol of conservation success, collectors want her specifically because of her notoriety. She's unique merchandise, one of a kind, worth significantly more than a normal juvenile because of the story attached to her. The irony was brutal. Amara's photographs, the National Geographic article, the international attention that had raised millions for gorilla conservation, all of it had inadvertently painted a target on baby Amara's back. Their efforts to celebrate her survival had made her valuable to exactly the kind of people they'd been fighting against. What do we do? Amara asked, feeling sick with guilt. We increase patrols, remove all traps, try to identify and arrest the poachers before they can act, Samuel said. But we're operating with limited resources and extensive territory. We can't guarantee baby Amara's safety unless we take more extreme measures. What kind of extreme measures? Elena demanded. Samuel hesitated before answering. We could capture baby Amara and Kora, relocate them to a sanctuary where they'd be protected but not free. Or we could try to relocate the entire troop to a different territory, though that carries significant risks and might not even work if the poachers simply follow them. Or, said a quiet voice from the back of the room, we could use baby Amara as bait to catch the poachers. Everyone turned toward David Okonkwo, who'd been working at the conservation station for 3 years now, rebuilding his reputation through tireless dedication to ranger duties and community education. He looked uncomfortable under the scrutiny but continued, the poachers want baby Amara specifically. They're watching her patterns, waiting for the right moment. What if we give them that moment with us waiting to arrest them when they take it? You're suggesting we deliberately put baby Amara in danger? Elena's voice was sharp with anger. I'm suggesting, David said carefully, that she's already in danger and will continue to be in danger as long as there's a market for exotic animals and criminals willing to supply it. We can react defensively forever, or we can use the situation to catch the people actively threatening her. The room erupted in argument. Half the team supported David's suggestion as a pragmatic response to an impossible situation. The other half condemned it as morally reprehensible, risking an individual animal's welfare for broader enforcement goals. Amara said nothing, her mind spinning through scenarios and consequences. This was her fault, her photographs, her fame, her decision to make baby Amara a public symbol. If the gorilla was captured or killed because of the attention Amara had brought to her story, that blood would be on her hands as surely as if she'd set the traps herself. Finally, she stood, and the room quieted. Before we decide anything, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil underneath, we need to ask one question. What would Kora want? She made a choice 4 years ago to trust humans with her baby's life. She made that choice again during the snare injury. If she could understand our options now, what would she choose, freedom with danger or safety without freedom? The question hung in the air, unanswerable but essential. How did you determine what agency to extend to a wild animal? How did you balance protection against autonomy when the subject couldn't consent to or refuse the terms being debated? Gorillas choose freedom, Elena said finally, her scientific objectivity giving way to something more fundamental. Every behavioral study we have shows that captive gorillas experience stress, depression, reduced life satisfaction compared to wild populations, even when captive conditions are objectively safer and more comfortable. If we're honoring Kora's trust, we're honoring her choice to remain wild and raise her family in natural conditions, even with the risks that entails. Then we protect them where they are, Samuel decided. We increase patrols, use technology, drones, cameras, acoustic monitoring to track both the gorillas and potential poachers. We try to arrest the criminals before they can act, and we accept that we can't guarantee perfect safety because perfect safety requires captivity, which violates the trust Kora placed in us. It was the right decision, Amara knew, but also the terrifying one. They were choosing to leave baby Amara vulnerable because respecting her mother's trust meant respecting the wild as her rightful home, even when the wild contained dangers that humans had created and now struggled to control. Over the following weeks, the conservation team implemented an unprecedented monitoring operation. Drones surveilled the territory continuously. Rangers patrolled in rotation, ensuring humans were always within response distance. Acoustic sensors detected gunshots or distress calls instantly, and Amara embedded herself with the observation teams, documenting everything while maintaining constant vigilance for threats. The poachers, meanwhile, adapted to the increased security. They moved slower, more carefully, leaving fewer traces. The surveillance cameras disappeared, presumably relocated to positions the rangers hadn't disc of. Arid. And the traps became more sophisticated, softer cables that didn't cut as deeply. Tranquilizer darts instead of snares, methods designed to capture without injuring the high-value merchandise they sought. 3 weeks into the heightened alert, Kora's troop exhibited strange behavior. Bakari led them on an unusual route that diverged from established patterns, moving toward the territorial boundary they rarely approached. The monitoring team followed at a respectful distance, confused by the deviation but trusting there was purpose behind it. They understood when they reached the boundary marker, a river that served as natural demarcation between adjacent territories. On the opposite bank stood another troop, led by a silverback the rangers had named Themba. The two troops had limited history of interaction, maintaining peaceful distance through mutual territory respect, but today Bakari led his troop directly to the river's edge. And Kora, after scanning the area carefully, lifted baby Amara and carried her into the water. What happened next was unprecedented in documented gorilla behavior. Kora was deliberately transferring baby Amara to Themba's troop. The researchers watched in stunned silence as Kora crossed the river with her daughter, approached Themba directly, and after a complex series of vocalizations and gestures, placed baby Amara on the ground between the two silverbacks. Bakari joined them, adding his own vocalizations to whatever negotiation was occurring. Baby Amara looked confused, distressed, clinging to her mother while glancing between the strange male and her familiar family. Kora groomed her daughter, made reassuring sounds, then gently pushed her toward Themba's troop. The message was clear. Kora was placing her daughter with another troop for protection. She'd assessed the danger in her own territory, recognized that baby Amara's notoriety made her vulnerable, and made the calculated decision to separate her from the family in order to ensure her survival. It was heartbreaking, sophisticated, and exactly the kind of complex reasoning that Kora had demonstrated before. Themba examined baby Amara carefully, assessing her disability, her demeanor, her compatibility with his troop structure. After several tense minutes, he made a vocalization that primatologists would later interpret as acceptance. Baby Amara was being adopted into a new family. Kora returned to her troop without her daughter, and they crossed back over the river. Baby Amara tried to follow, but Themba blocked her gently, redirecting her attention toward several young juveniles in his troop who approached with curiosity. The transfer was complete. Amara watched through binoculars with tears streaming down her face, witnessing another impossible choice being made by a mother who understood sacrifice. Kora was giving up daily contact with her daughter, was breaking their bond deliberately, was choosing separation over shared danger. Because that's what mothers did, Amara thought. They made terrible choices for their children's protection. They let go when holding on meant increased risk. They endured their own pain to reduce their offspring's vulnerability. She sang goodbye, Elena whispered beside her, filming every moment while her own voice broke. She's protecting baby Amara the only way she knows how, by removing her from the target zone. For 3 days, the conservation team monitored both troops, documenting baby Amara's integration into Themba's family. The young gorilla struggled initially, showing signs of distress and attempting repeatedly to return to Kora. But the juveniles in Themba's troop proved welcoming, including her in their play, showing her the territory's resources, helping her navigate with 3 limbs through unfamiliar terrain. By the 4th day, baby Amara had stopped trying to cross the river. She was forming bonds with her new family, adapting to different social dynamics, beginning to accept her relocated life. And on the 5th day, the poachers struck Kora's territory with coordinated precision, attacking at dawn, targeting the locations where baby Amara should have been based on weeks of surveillance, finding nothing but confused rangers and guerrillas who'd fundamentally altered their patterns. The operation was a failure for the criminals, who fled before rangers could make arrests, but left behind equipment that would provide evidence for future prosecutions. But it was a victory for Kora's strategic thinking, for maternal intelligence that had protected her daughter by predicting human behavior and adapting accordingly. Amara returned to the river boundary one final time before leaving Virunga. She sat on the bank where Kora had crossed, looking toward where Themba's troop was feeding in the distance. Baby Amara was visible among them, smaller than the others, moving differently but integrated and alive and safe. She opened her locket, looking at the 3 photographs it now held. Lily from before, Naya from recent visits, baby Amara as an infant in Kora's arms. 3 children connected to her through crisis and choice, all of them protected by mothers who'd understood when to hold on and when letting go was the greater act of love. Elena found her there, sitting in contemplative silence. Kora made the right choice, the primatologist said. The poachers will eventually lose interest if they can't locate baby Amara. She'll be safer in Themba's troop, without the fame and notoriety that made her a target. I made her a target, Amara said quietly. My photographs, my articles, my need to share her story, I painted a bullseye on her back. You also raised millions for conservation, Elena countered. You inspired an entire generation to care about gorilla protection. You documented behaviors that expanded our understanding of primate cognition. Baby Amara's story saved hundreds of other gorillas through the attention and funding it generated. But at what cost to her specifically? Elena sat down beside her friend. At the cost of fame she never asked for and didn't benefit from. That's the ethical dilemma we face constantly in conservation, using individual animal stories to protect entire species, knowing that the attention we bring can create risks for the specific individuals we're trying to help. She paused, then added quietly, It's not different from how you feel about Naya. You lost years with her, but your loss led you to work that protects hundreds of other children through the trafficking investigations your case helped trigger. So we're all just sacrificing individuals for collective good? Amara asked bitterly. No, Elena said firmly. We're making impossible choices in situations where every option carries costs, and we're trying to minimize harm while maximizing benefit. That's all anyone can do. That's all Kora can do. That's all you can do. They sat together as the sun set, watching the river flow between territories, separating families while providing the boundaries that allowed both to survive. Everything about conservation was compromise, Amara thought. Everything about love was impossible choices. Everything about being human meant living with the consequences of decisions made with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. But some things were certain. Baby Amara was alive. Naya was thriving. Kora had successfully protected her family through intelligence that transcended instinct. And Amara had learned, through pain and photography and relationships that defied categorization, that motherhood was larger and more complex than biology or possession could contain. The wild had chosen her 5 years ago, had tested her with trust she didn't think she could honor, had taught her lessons she'd needed but couldn't have articulated, and the wild was teaching her still about sacrifice and separation, about love that,